This is Paul. Hopefully, we'll get through this time. I think we will. Well, that depends on how much playing of other things that I do. So I finished recording this stuff last week, Wednesday, because of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I had kids in from out of town and church things, and so I haven't sat in this chair recorded any content since then. But there's been a slug of good stuff that's been out, much of which I'd like to treat. Jonathan Pageau had a conversation with Bishop Barron after this one, and a conversation with John Vervaeke after this one. I thought the conversation with John Vervaeke was outstanding. In a lot of ways, it covered a bunch of the stuff that I've been covering with Vervaeke over the last couple of years, and so I feel some of these conversations are sort of coming to a head. But over the weekend, I thought a lot about the hole left in the culture where the church used to be, because I'm trying to get a handle on Jordan Peterson's reaction, implicit posture towards the church, John Vervaeke's posture towards the church. I was just this morning listening to Audrey Assad, a vocalist whose music I've really loved. I really love her music. And a guy who was a musician became an Orthodox priest. Justin Brierley had them on, thinking about part of why she's no longer identifies as a Christian. That's very much God number one, God number two stuff. But for part of what haunts these conversations is, again, the hole left in the culture without the church. Part of that came in the American experiment, where there is no federal state church. There were state. Now, the United States is strange because we have this nation which is made up of states, not provinces. And a lot of people don't know that at the founding of the United States of America, many of the states had state churches. The federal government did not have a state church. Massachusetts was one of the last states to no longer, well, they're a commonwealth, to no longer have a state church. That was towards the end of the first third of the 19th century. So this experiment over the last 200 plus years of trying to have a culture without a church is sort of what we're coming to the end of. And it's by no means clear how to go beyond this. And in some ways, the Orthodox would love to step in and say, let's pick up where Constantine left off. And Rome would love to say, well, we already have Rome. What else do we need? What happened in Northern Europe, again, was a bunch of these Protestant state churches, which I have very little experience of. Some of you have more experience of them. There remains a state church in the Netherlands. There remains a state church in England. So, but they are by no means acting in the way that it seems implicitly Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke would like the church to respond. And so I see, in terms of big, long-term conversations, this is sort of where a lot of these questions go. Because at the end of modernity is sort of the secret sister of the church. Secularism is. And secularism sort of says, well, we can sort of act as if that whole isn't really there, even though there is no institution there, and everything will be fine. Now, I'm going to pick up pretty much where I left off, where at this point in the psychedelic conversation, where it'll really turn much more towards the church, because Jordan Peterson sees psychedelics, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback from many of you on psychedelics, and going both ways. Do you really want your minister prescribing powerful hallucinogenic drugs? I don't. I don't want to do it. I don't want my colleagues doing it. A number of you recognize that there is a church, a denomination in the Americas that has ayahuasca as sort of a sacrament. Okay, and this is sort of the experimentation of Protestantism. I should maybe pull up some of the tweets I had last weekend, but they're not so easy to pull up on Twitter. Well, maybe they're not too bad. The culture is sort of caving in on that hole that was left where the church used to be. And it's different in Europe, of course, because in some ways the cathedrals still stand, and the cathedrals offer this realm of mystery, and it's almost like Jordan. You'd think after what he's been through in the last couple of years, he'd have a little bit more hesitation about the use of pharmaceuticals to really jumpstart something. I just finished also this morning watching his Cambridge Commons video, which was outstanding. I haven't seen Jordan that good for a very long time. I love the Jordan who's the clinical psychologist, who's pragmatic and practical. And part of the real crime of what's been done to him and his career, both as a university professor and as a clinical psychologist, is that in many ways he can't do either like he used to. And part of the problem with no longer being able to do that is your stories get old. It's part of the reason, people sometimes say, well, Paul, if you really worked on boosting up your Patreon and, did a bunch of other things, you could get a bigger following and then you could leave Living Stones. Yeah, but then all my stories get old. I went to seminary with a bunch of professors who were wonderful, dear men. Many of the people at seminary who were my professors weren't so much academics. They were an older generation that was just retiring when I was getting there, but they had been pastors who had gotten advanced degrees, and there was a real difference between the seminary faculty that had done considerable work in local churches with real people and the seminary faculty that had spent all of their time in the academy and thought they had some understanding of what it's like to work in a church because they go to church, but actually had very little pastoral experience. And by very little, I mean maybe only 1 or 2 years instead of decades. And so what tends to happen, though, even for those professors that had had decades of pastoral experience, time moves fast in this culture and their experience gets old. And so part for me of the joy of James Frazee corrected me, third hemisphere, not third lobe. And was it you, Grim, that led me down that bad nomenclature? Got to be careful how much Grim Grizz I watch. I got to throw some of those saving throws myself. A third hemisphere. I'd love for Jordan to be able to do some of the things that clearly makes his heart sing. Part of what's key, maybe I'll just play it from the Cambridge conversation, was his mission statement which is he wants to save Western civilization one person at a time. That's really what he's up to. And he in that sense wants to be able to dispense among crowds broadly through his books, through his videos, what he was able to do person by person as a clinical psychologist for proximal betterment. It's John Vervaeke. It's so, in part of the reason I listen to Grim Grizz and a bunch of the other guys doing commentary on my video is I learned so much from you doing commentary on my video. I learned a ton. And, John Vervaeke, when I keep talking about Dead Reckoning, John Vervaeke says, well, Jordan talks about that. I'm thinking, well, how does Jordan talk about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Dead Reckoning? And then I listened to it and I thought, oh, yeah, he is talking about that. It's sort of this, when you're working with people they're real people, they're in a context, they have real struggles, they have real problems. It's you work towards proximal betterment, really. Let's make life a little bit better. And so Jordan, that Cambridge video was really right there again. And I really haven't heard him there again. Part of that is context of these conversations. But I haven't seen him there for a while.
There's no political reason to have some suffering person under your dominion carry a sack of wet salt that weighs 100 pounds from one side of a compound to another. No, that's you, man. Corrupt right to hell. And so, you think that
practically a Calvinist.
That's pretty terrible, and it is pretty terrible, but there is one advantage to specifying evil in a very distinctive and precise manner, is that when you specify something that precisely, you also specify its opposite, right? So if there's evil of that depth, then, well, there, at least in principle, might be the opposite of that, which would be the force that might resist it. And so while I was looking into the heart of darkness, let's say, the light started to shine through. And, partly when I started to understand. It was a little bit before that.
And this, I think, is his core story. This is Jordan. This is the core of his mission. And that's what people don't understand. His mission isn't finally political. And you'll hear him say things like, well, I'm not really a political person. You say, hey, you keep talking about politics and culture war. Yeah, he does. But that's all in service of this. This, for Jordan, is the center of his soteriology.
You should not lie.
And I shouldn't say soteriology is his plan of salvation. Sorry.
That's when it started to shine through. And, partly when I started to understand. It was a little bit before that you should not lie. That's a big mistake. You think you can, first of all, I'll tell you one thing, that
I don't know what happens in this Cambridge Union where this girl at the yellow vest sits next to him. It's like she got there last and got the seat right next to the speaker. And I don't know who's setting up the camera shots, but just get up, watch her. She went on her nails. She's checking her watch. She's checking her phone. She's bored. Peterson, when he talks, he likes to zoom in right on one person and talk right to them. He always says that's the best way to do it. And, just wait for him to turn and just be, you got probably a little distance between them. That's partly the camera angle, but, just zoom right in on her and say, ah!
I never saw any of my clinical clients ever get away with anything, ever. We track their misery back to its origination point, and sometimes it was a mistake on their part, often a moral error, which they knew was a moral error when they were committing it, but may have forgotten about afterwards. So
moral error, like, working on those cuticles on a video that 500,000 people are going to watch. Oh, I feel so bad for her.
Became unconscious in some sense.
Are you talking to me? I'm sorry. I distract myself. He's talking such serious stuff in here. This is the core of Jordan Peterson's thing, and I can't help but watch her work on her nails with her Apple Watch. It's just the perfect little picture. This is the culture in a snow globe right here. We just turn it over and Jordan Peterson's falling down and she's just sitting there and just meaning as like, I think it was my friend who sends me the art, and She's like, oh, my mates are at the pub. When's this guy going to end? He's only answered 5 questions. We've been here for an hour and a half. But yeah, like I'm one to blame if you ever listen to my question and answers.
Habitual, or it was a moral error that someone else that they were beholden to.
Was she thinking about picking the nose? I don't know.
Lie on the part of their mother, father, someone they were taking.
Okay. I got to go back. I got to listen to him again. I got to stop being distracted by the girl in the yellow vest. Doom. I just can't help see her every time. You keep this camera angle, and then I can focus.
It's a big mistake. You think you can, first of all, I'll tell you one thing, that I never saw any of my clinical clients ever get away with anything ever. We'd track their misery back to its origination point, and sometimes it was a mistake on their part, often a moral error, which they knew was a moral error when they were committing it, but may have forgotten about afterwards, so it became unconscious in some sense, or habitual, or it was a moral error that someone else that they were beholden to, a lie on the part of their mother or father, someone they were tangled up with, someone malevolent. But yeah, the pigeons come home to roost, man. And how...
That's a C.S. Lewis point too. It's a big C.S. Lewis point. Everything you do is moving you a little closer to heaven or a little closer to hell. I remember the first time I heard him say that, he was on Dave Rubin with Ben Shapiro, and he said it, was like, bang! That's nearly word for word out of C.S. Lewis's mouth. And that's before, to my knowledge, he had read a lot of Lewis.
How could it be otherwise? You really think you have the capacity to bend the structure of reality without it eventually snapping back and hitting you in the face? Like, how arrogant can you possibly be to think that? And so, well, I came to believe that truth in particular, spoken truth, but not only spoken truth, was the antidote to that evil and to that suffering, really, truly the antidote to that. It's more complex than that, but that's something. And I also came to believe that each of us have far more.
And another piece of Jordan's success has been his scalability, because a lot of the conversations we're having in this corner of the internet, they're just way up here in the stratosphere. And because of his experience as a clinical psychologist, he's got this scalability to bring it right down. God and blah, 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 blah. No! Stop lying. Let's talk about your life. Do you have any friends? Why not? What can you do to get some friends? Now, also in this video, he says some things which are, right out of this corner of the internet. And, when he says, I stopped directing people, and then, well, that's right. And, after one of the things that he's learned after this is to have more open conversations. And that's right. I mean, the Cambridge Union video is one of the best Jordan Peterson videos I've seen in a long, long time.
Under our dominion in terms of the destiny of the world, let's say, than we would ever even care to dare to dread, let's say. I don't know how it works, but each of us, we make decisions between heaven and hell all the time, with every decision, in fact.
That's Lewis. That's right out of Mere Christianity.
Every decision, that's a decision, up or down. And in some manner, the whole collective enterprise is guided by those individual decisions.
Right there. There's his mission statement. There's his path of salvation. Change the individual, change the world. It's very evangelical, because in many ways, evangelicalism is sort of Protestant Christianity applicable to that. Make more Christians, have a better world. If you make more Christians, you don't necessarily need the structure of the church at the center of society where that hole is now. You instead, it's just filled up with all those Christians. And in many ways, in the United States, that's sort of been the way to address it. Now, that doesn't necessarily address everything, but that's sort of been the North American approach to a society. You don't necessarily need an institution like a state church or the Roman Catholic Church or an Orthodox Church of Russian Orthodox or Antiochian Orthodox or something like that. You don't need a structure. You just need Christians to fill it up, and they'll be close enough to a structure that will get you there. And so it's in that sense, I made videos about this years ago. It's in that sense that Peterson is very, very Protestant and almost evangelical.
It's not washed away in the mix, it's somehow not just your trivial action in a sea of 7 billion random actions. We're networked, and our actions echo, and what we do or don't do, or what we do deceitfully, has ramifications far beyond what we can immediately see, or often are willing to immediately see. It's like, the only more frightening realization than nothing you do matters is the realization that everything you do matters.
If you can find a conversation between Tim Keller and kind of a New Age-ish author where he's asked about divine election. Now, Tim Keller is Presbyterian Church of America. That's a confessional Reformed church. And when asked about sovereignty, God's sovereignty, providence, divine election, these things, he made that's exactly the same point as Peterson. And I think it's dead right. If you think that everything is up to you, well, the butterfly effect is this is, you're not going to have a meaning crisis. You're going to have a crisis of too much meaning. If you think nothing you do matters, well, then you're having a meaning crisis. And both are true in some ways. But again, this is where Peterson is really good, and where he's able to really scale down to the granular, as well as having conversations at this other level.
It's like you want to pick an existential terror. You think meaninglessness is terrifying. You try its opposite, and you'll see how terrifying that is. But it's a terror. It's a holy terror, right? It's a terror that sustains and ennobles. And every single person knows that that is true. Knows that you're fleeing from your destiny by avoidance of the necessary responsibility that your conscience calls you towards. Everyone knows that. And we toy with it because we can, and we try to avoid it because we test, we're immature, and we're bitter often, and it's not surprising because people suffer dreadfully, and it's very difficult to suffer dreadfully without becoming bitter, but it doesn't help. All it does is make...
You're checking your phone now! Sit somewhere else. Set up your room differently. I beg you.
Suffering worse and spreads it, and if the suffering is morally objectionable, spreading it is hard.
Well, she should just reach around with it and just quick grab a selfie with Peterson.
Hardly going to rectify that. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic about our possibilities, because I think we can do anything we set our minds to. And so, hopefully, we'll set our minds to the proper things. And every single one of you have to make that decision. And one of the things I've really been struck by, I talked with Andy No 2 weeks ago. I'd spoken to some moderate Democrats.
Is he going to turn around and say, young lady, is now really the proper time to be looking at your phone? Haven't you just taken a couple tiny little ticks down towards hell instead of up to heaven? I mean, do your nails at home. Sit in the back. What? Anyway, I got to listen to that video and not watch it. But when I do these, I watch them. So keeping that in mind. So why the psychedelics? And again, I see, maybe I should play the other piece of that video too, which was so outstanding. Hopefully she's not in it. Here it is. This is another great part.
How your view on relationships has changed. And since you talked at the union 3 years ago, how have your other opinions changed and why?
and again, the little one of my less desirable members of my consciousness Congress wants to say, and are you no longer a custodian of the patriarchy and all those culture war issues? And I loved his answer here. I thought his answer here was, oh, the dude has a Yankee shirt on. He can't be all bad, except for that headband.
Well, one thing that's changed, most of this is a deepening, I would say, rather than a transformation of beliefs. But it's a deepening and a specification of things that I more dimly apprehended before. One of the things I've really learned more explicitly, I would say, in the last 6 months is to not win. I knew this already. Like in my clinical practice, I tried my best not to be right.
And this is something I was going to say you learn as a pastor, but I know plenty of pastors who haven't learned it ever. This is something you can learn as a pastor, which sounds strange because the church is all about giving the right answers, but and there's truth to that too.
You know, so for example, as a clinician, you can dispense advice. And so it'd be quite easy, especially if I wasn't suffering at that time while practicing as a clinician. And the person was, I think, well, you know, I've got my life together pretty well, and I'll just tell you what you should do. And sometimes people would ask for that, right? But it's not that helpful because, well,
some people ask me for that, and then they say, well, just tell me what to do. And I said, I've told you plenty to do, and you haven't done what I've said. So maybe when you start doing what I've told you to do before, I'll give you some more advice. Until then, we're going to resume with plan A, which is just doing a lot of listening and some encouraging, and every now and then just a little nudge and say, did you think about this?
What the hell do you know about what they should do? You know, you can introduce topics of conversation like, well...
Now, keep that in mind, because that's going to come up a little bit later in the Peterson, Barron, Vervaeke, Pageau conversation, because this reactive posture is in all of us.
Well, most people have friends, and you don't seem to have any, and, you know, maybe you have a reason for that, and maybe it's a, you know, fundamentally valid reason, and that's not where your interests are oriented. Maybe you're particularly introverted, which doesn't mean you don't need friends. But that's way different than saying, well, here's what you should do. And the problem with here's what you should do is, first of all, as the psychoanalysts knew, you just set up resistances in people. And the reason, so they won't do it, even if they want your advice, and often they'll do the opposite, just out of spite, and probably they should, because they're basically saying, up yours. It's like, this is my life, man, not yours. And the other problem with advice is...
Keep that in mind when we have Peterson thinking about church and the hole in the culture where the church used to be.
Well, let's say you take my advice and then you go do something good. It's like, well, whose victory is that? Is it yours or mine? So did I just steal your victory? Well, that's not so good. And so I learned that pretty thoroughly as a clinician, not to do that, and hopefully as a husband and father, also not to do that. But in my talks with people like Sam Harris, I was more instrumental.
And actually, when I think about my father, that's something my father knew well. And Peterson talks in this video. I loved this video. This was a great video. Better than the Four Horsemen video, frankly. Not to take anything away from, I mean, just conversations are different. I know I did some ranking in the first one, and some people loved it and some people hated it. People shouldn't, I'm not grading the people. I'm rating performance. I'm rating a particular conversation. I'm rating the angel of the conversation if you're deep into Jonathan Pageau. And you know, my sermons are not like my children. You know, sometimes they're horrible. And anyway, so he talks about his father and he talks about his mother, and it was deeply personal in this. And part of this was, I think it was Peterson. It was Peterson. Again, he's surrounded by some students. And one of the deep tragedies of this whole chapter has been the loss of him for, you know, the university. And I know they have this another one starting in Austin, and I think it would be nothing better for Jordan to find a place there and to be able to teach classes again and to be able to have a clinical practice again, and alongside of the book writing and the other stuff too. Because again, there's things you can do. You have to keep close to the knitting, to the texture of life. That's the continual fount of freshness and new information, and that's how you can actually continue to stay vital in a conversation.
Mental than I should have been. There were points I was trying to make, you know, and I was trying to be right. And you know, there's times for that, and there's partisan situations where only one side can win and another side has to lose. An election is like that. But I've really learned, I hope, that in the last 6 or 7 months to not do that, And so the last conversation I had with Sam Harris, which was 2 weeks ago, which will be released in a relatively short order, was by far the best conversation we ever had. And all I did was ask him questions. And that wasn't manipulative. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to, you know, and no one here in the audience has done this yet, but lots of times people ask me questions. They're not questions. They're disguised criticisms, or they're statements of belief, or they're an observation that perhaps if my Christian beliefs, for example, were more fully differentiated, I accepted Christ as my Savior, that would be a good thing. That comes up quite often. And they're not questions. Like a question is something you want.
Just write down next time I see Jordan Peterson. Okay, Jordan, has your Christian, have you become more differentiated? Have you accepted Jesus into your heart? I shouldn't joke, but
The answer to, like, actually, you want to know what the person thinks. And so all I did was ask Harris questions, and I learned all sorts of things about the way he thought that I didn't know, and about commonalities in our approach to problems that I didn't understand.
And so those of you who have been following my channel for a while and don't just listen to the videos I make about Peterson or the videos I make about Tom Holland or the videos I make about whatever, but have listened to the Randall's conversation, that's exactly the point of those. This is how people change. Slowly. It takes time. Listening again to the, maybe I'll pull it up on the screen. Listening to this conversation with Audrey Assad, and we also live in such a strange world because I'm so deeply moved by her music, and then the same with Jennifer Knapp. I love Jennifer Knapp's rawness in her music, and I especially the ones before she sort of made peace with her sexuality, as it were. People are not widgets to be converted. People are image bearers to be loved. And if you don't get that, you don't get Jesus. That's what we're here to do. And things can get all tangled up, sometimes for the best of intentions. But that's why, when I first started making videos, I'd get emails from people who'd say, I was talking to someone on the channel who wasn't a Christian, and then I failed to present the gospel to them in just the right way that they were imagining. And I'd get an email. There's one woman used to write me, and she'd be like, what if they die right after the conversation? And that's why I'm a Calvinist, because in a sense, Calvinism says, okay, that's God's business. Okay? I'm not going to presume to sit in his chair. And it doesn't mean that what we're doing here doesn't matter, and it isn't some blind election. It's just that the ways of the Almighty are his, and he has given me things to do, and I must do them. And at the core of doing them is to love his image bearers, as Christ loved the church, because that's the whole story. And so we have a conversation, and we talk, and we meet. And whether it's Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett or Richard Dawkins or a Nazi or a racist or a whatever person you think is beyond the pale and reprehensible, you sit and you talk, and you hope that in the process of the conversation, they might, in one way or another, have a little bit of a window open to the grace and mercy and joy and beauty of God, that they might see God, and they might say, if I'm going to spend eternity somewhere, I'd like it to be with him, because he is the source of beauty and joy and everything good that I have, even if I've had a wretched life, come to just taste a little bit of. Is there anything better?
The conversation was much more enjoyable. I mean, the give and take of our previously more tendentious conversations had, what would you say? There was an element of sort of combative enjoyment to them. So they weren't nothing, and they were reasonably successful as public spectacles and I suppose as philosophical investigations, but this was way better, way better. And I understood what motivated Sam way more than I did before. And I've been doing a lot of, I hope, political peacemaking between Democrats and Republicans in the US, because that better happen. And, you know, I've managed on the moderate Democrat side to convince, to learn along with a variety of moderate Democrats that even when dealing with their, you know, the people across the aisle, that winning is not a good strategy, or maybe it's better than losing. Let's say it's not an optimal strategy, right? That's a better way of thinking about it. And if you're trying to win a conversation, that might be better than losing, you know? But it's not as good as mutual elevation in the progression of the discourse. That's way better. That's a real victory. And so I hope that I've learned that, you know, more deeply, and that I can take that to heart more deeply, and then I can govern my actions. I have conversations that are very tense with people. Well, I always have. And that certainly hasn't stopped. And I have to tread very carefully. And any...
I imagine he always has.
Instrumentalism on my part, you know, because one of the things you want to do when you win is dominate in some sense, right? And that's a cheap victory, I would say. It's better than losing, perhaps, you know, because sometimes you can retreat and let the other person have the floor, let's say. But
Dallas Willard, who used to teach at philosophy at USC and was a remarkable Christian man, one of his rules was never have the last word. That was all about this.
It's not the optimal solution, not at all. And man, you just have no idea how far you can get with people if what you do is ask them questions because you're interested in what they think. And it's so damn useful for them, because then in the discourse they reveal.
And it's the power of love. That's what it is. Because to love is to listen, and to listen is to love.
Elements of themselves that they really didn't know. And what's also interesting, I've seen people do this. I had a striking example of that within my own family, where one of my family members had a grudge against another, and we waited it out instead of confronting it directly. And the person with the grudge laid
Must have been hard on Jordan. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know.
Out why they had the grudge. And it was a character description of the person they were angry with. And it was so unlike the person that while the person who had the grudge was revealing the story, they realized that this was some fantasy they'd concocted like 15 years previously and pretty much abandoned it right after the utterance.
And it takes time to get to that point. And I think part of this is the terror of a godless world where there is no time, because if there is no purpose, if there is no telos, if there is no destiny bigger or larger than ours, then it's all chance and chaos, and it's going to go careening off. And the reason that people believe that, because they've seen things go careening off. I understand that. Things careen. There's a crappy towel that's full of someone's shit right outside my door, and I'm going to have to clean it up a little bit later, and I'll have a bad attitude about it, and there's toilet paper and shit strewn right outside my office. I can't open my office door without smelling the feces of my fellow man. The people I love. Life is like this. And so you take time, and I know that many of the people that I have loved, who have lived in the street, have died before they have achieved or received any kind of redemption that I would have for them. I know that. But I also know that the cheap forced tricks seldom achieve what we want them to achieve either. And that doesn't mean there isn't a time for involuntary incarceration, or, you know, I'm not saying, not making any of those statements. I'm just saying, again, there is a time to stop someone in their tracks and to confront them, and I've done that, and I've done it and it's worked, and I've done it and it hasn't. But again, people are image bearers to be loved, not problems to be fixed. That's what people are.
And so that happens frequently, you know, if you really disagree with someone. First of all, that's interesting because you're wrong and stupid. And if they really disagree with you, they might know something that you really need to know, right? Rather than talking to someone that already agrees with you. I mean, that's hard because there's still points of conflict, but it's worth digging for that if you can find it. And then there's also the possibility that many of the differences are purely misunderstandings. That's very frequently the case. And then there's also the possibility that while the person engages in this dialogue, well, first of all, they're happy about you because you're listening, and people love that, man. They love that. More than you listen to people, you really listen to them instead of thinking about what you're going to say next or trying to win. You'll have so many people around you so soon that you won't even be able to stand it.
There's my life right there, right there. I started listening to people online, and now I've got too many people online, and I apologize to many of you that I haven't gotten back, and you've asked for conversations, and you can never get a rando slot, and you want me on your little podcast, or you want me to write something for you, and I never got back, and I haven't done it. The world is weird.
So that's really something, man, to do that. And so that's a pathway to peace, that listening, that's for sure.
All right. Now, I wasn't going to make a video about this video. I was going to make a video about this video. And when it comes down to the psychedelics again, I just look at this as is this how we're going to get people's attention? Again, I'm not saying it doesn't, and I don't want pastors administering this stuff. I'm not going to.
So okay, so let me, Jonathan, I'm curious about this. I mean, your cautions are duly noted on my end. I see what happened, say in retrospect, when the hallucinogens were introduced to Western culture, right? I mean, it didn't work very well.
And many people are self-medicating with them. I mean, what's going on at Johns Hopkins, I think, is a world different from people playing around with the stuff, which I think is the vast majority of cases of their use.
And look at what happened to Timothy Leary. So, for example, I had his old job at Harvard, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Many people have pointed that out to me,
Position.
Jordan, by the way.
Yeah. Jesus, of all the weird things. In any case, you know, Mircea Eliade also believed that the true shamanic tradition wasn't psychedelic driven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, and that was an aberration. I think he was wrong. I really do believe that he was wrong. And I think that, and I'm also not entirely convinced that the practices that you're describing can produce experiences that are as intense as those that are produced chemically. Maybe they are, but even if they are, they're not available to the typical person. They take tremendous amount of training, and then so that's a big problem. And then
Is that a problem or is that a feature?
Well,
and right there, we have the question of scale, not only in terms of scale about those who are maybe have low IQ, those who have had less opportunity at education, those who have on a let's say a vocational spectrum, those who work with their hands rather than with their lips and their minds and words. I mean, there's lots of different scales. And part of what we want is a society where people are listened to and people are loved. And part of the problem that we have now is that people who are anti-hierarchical, well, one of the ways we have created hierarchies is that now your local pastor is compared to Bishop Barron or to me. And I can't have a relationship with you like you can have with your local pastor or your small group leader or your father or your mother or your grandfather. And so a big part of this scale is deployment, which sort of naturally works in meat space, but which, you had it with writing and then with books and the printing press and now with the internet. Suddenly there's these hierarchies where, oh, sure, maybe Tim Keller can preach a better sermon than your local pastor, but Tim Keller can't listen to your story or know you or love you face to face. And that's, and I agree with Jonathan, and I don't want to get off. The point of this video is not the psychedelics, okay? I wanted to put that in a video and say, it's over there. The point of this video is the church, the hole in the culture that the church left behind.
It seems like a feature.
Yeah, look, it's a feature too, Jonathan, because maybe you need to do all that training to handle the insight. And I'm not trying to look for a facile solution here, believe me. But the church has a hard time attracting people at the moment.
Okay, right there. The church has a hard time attracting people at the moment. Why do you care? And here's the sense with both John and Jordan, as opposed to Bishop Robert Barron and Jonathan Pageau, is disappointment with the church, hurt by the church. Again, if you listen to this conversation with Audrey Assad, it just breaks my heart listening to this poor girl.
Inspired particularly that tweet that got a lot of attention earlier in the year when you said, I no longer consider myself a practicing Christian. What had been the journey up to that point?
Well, so in 2016, I was diagnosed with PTSD because I was having anxiety and panic attacks with unknown origin. Well, the anxiety attacks had an origin. Panic attacks don't usually. It's sort of like you don't know what the trigger is for those. I had several different battles on that front. And I was going to trauma therapy with a Christian therapist, actually, who at the time that I was going to see her, I could not even say the word God without triggering an anxiety attack. It was really, really hard. And so I had to cancel most of the shows I was doing. I couldn't walk into a church building. I could not bear to be in mass. It was really, really sad because I did not desire for that to be my reality whatsoever. It was just sort of happening. And I realized, though, through those things, those notifications that my body was giving me, that I had some trauma to process that was spiritual in nature. Spiritual and religious abuse are very real things. And at that time, I had not really acknowledged or dealt with any of those realities from my upbringing, which both included my internalization of the doctrines is part of that, but also my experiences with human beings who did, in various ways, abuse their relationships to me. I had one kind of long experience of one of the elders in my church being sexually and romantically forward with me for years that resulted in a lot of pain and residual issues around spiritual leadership. And so that was the beginning of the deconstruction, which, again, I really wasn't looking for. It sort of just happened. And I found myself in it. And it was terrifying, partially because of my fears of hell and my fears of God and my fears of doing the wrong thing. And partially because my whole living had been made, in a world where that connection based on shared belief is very strong. People were listening to me partly because they liked my sound, but in large part also because they believed what I did or shared a lot of that,
Sure.
perspective on the world. So,
well, also the songs you were singing. I mean, some of my favorite stuff of hers is a lot of the hymn stuff, and so it's also using a tremendous gift of God given to her in terms of her voice and her musical talent to do that.
that makes a lot of sense. And I just was like, I feel so responsible for this and I want to be authentic and truthful, but I don't know where this is going to land. Like, I might go through this therapy and then be right back where I was. And so I don't want to say, right now that I'm leaving church, because I really didn't know if that would be the case.
Yeah.
I didn't want that to be the case, to be honest. And it's like a lot of, I'm hearing my critics in my head right now going, well, why not just go back if you didn't want to leave? And I wish it was that simple, and it's such a long story, and someday I'll tell it in more detail. But long and short of it is that after a few years of not going to Mass, because I kept trying to go to Mass and having panic attacks, I decided to be truthful about where I am right now. I didn't want people to feel like I was being deceitful by just kind of being quiet about it and not admitting what had gone on and what had shifted. And I did go through an angry phase where I had the burn it all down feeling. But again, it's not my style, I think, to come out of the gate with a torch while I'm still processing my own issues. And yeah.
And what I get from this story is you're as human as anyone else, Audrey. But the unfortunate aspect of it is that often people who are, Christian musicians or musicians in general, with a following, they kind of have to often process, their own journey kind of in public. And that can be a really difficult thing to do when you've got other people's expectations and following and everything else on your show.
And I'll get to John Vervaeke in a little bit, but again, they're trying. They see the culture collapsing in the hole that is in the culture where the church used to be, and so Jordan's conversations with Bishop Barron, the 2 one-on-ones that he's had, it cycles again and again back to this. And I know some people were really upset by my grading of Bishop Barron. He's your hero. I get that. And if you know my channel well enough, you can find me on at least 2 or 3 occasions just having a good bit of YouTuber lust over Bishop Barron. That sounds a little creepy, I know, but what I mean by that is, and he gets in there and he's got his, he's always so well dressed and he's so smart and he's so well educated. I watch that and I think, God, I'd like to be able to do that a little better. And instead I'm poking fun at the girl in the yellow vest. I mean, I kind of feel myself, I'm not all the way to Joe Rogan, but yeah, I'm a little bit of a monkey. And Bishop Barron is so refined and so smooth. And again, so many of the comments on the first video I did in the series were so helpful. One person mentioning he's a Roman Catholic bishop. You're going to hear the party line out of him. And that gets into this question of what Bishop Barron is about to talk about, this wisdom tradition. And well, let's let them have the conversation, then I'll talk about it.
And I don't know what's happening in the broad church with regards to the sort of work, for example, that Griffiths is doing. And it's not like I have the answers to these things, but we shouldn't.
Griffiths is. Did I get an invitation to that? I don't know. He's getting clergy. He's trying to get clergy to participate in these studies. I wouldn't, for a whole variety of reasons. But do I think it's a bad thing? Not necessarily. I'm open that way.
Look to the psychedelics as a savior, certainly, but they should also not.
No, we already have a savior.
Be discounted because they
discounted. Well, we'll see.
Are the means by which people can have
the means. He's speaking off the cuff.
Sorts of experiences that the scientists, the followers of scientism, discount. It's right there. It's right there.
And again, I look back to the first chapter of Miracles. C.S. Lewis, the only person I ever know who claims to have seen a ghost, doesn't believe in one. We're very subtle creatures.
As proof in some sense.
I'd be more at home,
maybe that's
though,
irrelevant to the
with
church.
using the wisdom tradition, Jordan, as you've been doing. I mean, the fact that you're drawing a lot of people back toward Christianity through the opening up of the Bible, and the wisdom way of reading the Bible. That to me is a great way the churches can start drawing, especially young people, back. It's obviously working in your case. We've got our problems, and some of it came from the scandals, certainly, but some came from an exaggerated attempt to be relevant to the society and to sort of dumb down our language and to make it sound like an echo of the culture. That's what did us in, I think, in terms of attracting younger.
You became more evangelical.
People. But
and I agree with many of the points here that Barron makes. But when I listen to Audrey Assad, and not just the clip that I played, but the whole thing, that's much more of what I hear. There are deeper questions. And so, and there are multiple issues and fronts because everyone's an individual and they participate in some and they don't participate in others. There definitely are patterns and commonalities, but, a lot of, I'll just let him finish.
What you're doing, opening up the scriptures, that's what the church fathers did. And people are flocking to that because they find in that the wisdom tradition. And through the wisdom tradition, they're finding mysticism, authentic mysticism, a contact with God. So I think that's the route to go. We have to deal with our moral issues. We have to deal with the scandals, that's for sure. And we have to deal, though, with this dumbing down of the faith and this flattening out of the faith. That's, I think, what has really compromised our mission.
Did the medieval faithful Catholic who was smuggling the Eucharist to his or her sick cow, was it dumbed down? I mean, we're part of why the scale problem is so difficult is because of many of our successes where, Audrey Assad will continue to say, well, she was raised in a Plymouth Brethren church and she believed, she never heard about Martin Luther until she was of a certain age. And I thought, oh my goodness, I heard of Martin Luther, almost right away. And so she had been raised in a narrow context, and the internet just sort of blows all that apart. And so part of the difficulty with the scale problem is to be able to resource and support. And I think a lot of that has to be personal. It has to go through the kinds of conversations and the listening and the kind of process that Jordan was talking about in that video. I couldn't find the portion in Reformations, but part of what happened in the Council of Trent after the Roman Catholic response to the Reformation was a really a modernization to have to contend with what was happening in the Protestant world, and the Roman Catholic Church had to do that. There's always this temptation to imagine that if the church had just kept doing what it had always done, then we wouldn't be in this mess, and just fill whatever you want in what we've always done and fill whatever you want in this mess. The truth is that the church responds to the challenges of each age, and in the process of leaving some things behind and trying to renew or do some new things, there is loss and difficulty. And with a culture that moves so quickly, it's really hard to get it right and keep it right, because keeping it right might mean getting it wrong 10 years from now, and so on and so forth. So, and what conversation did I hear about, Catholic churches, and I've had this too when I've discussed with Cale Zeldin and Brett Sockold, your Catholic church on your local street. Audrey Assad just made the comment. She grew up in New Jersey. Hey, way to go, Audrey. Well, I'm from New Jersey too. But yeah, Christmas and Easter Catholics, there are all kinds of them in New Jersey, and perfunctory, but we had perfunctory in the Christian Reformed Church too. So part of why I'm excited about Estuary is I want there to be more reading and conversation. And that's, part of it. So I've been posting my Sunday school class on this channel, and I fully know that watching my Sunday school class online is not anywhere as much fun as being there. And I'm hoping to let limited numbers of people into Zoom to be in there, but Rick and I are still trying to work out sound and a whole bunch of other things for that class and get it into a format that Rick and I can just basically get in and get out without me having to do a whole bunch of put up and take down every week. But in my adult Sunday school class, this is where we explore, and we do it with a small group of people, and it doesn't scale for everyone, just usually a handful of people in that Sunday school class. But I want people to say what they think, even if it's heterodox in the group. Because if that's what they think, that's what they think. And we're not going to deal with it unless we get it out there and get the chance to talk about it. And so if that's what Bishop Barron means about the wisdom, well, he's talking wisdom. And so we could think about it as sophiology. Did I just get your attention, Nate Heil? Thinking about it as wisdom and putting the pieces together.
Could I pick up on that?
Do you see any?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Because I think this is part. First of all, I want to challenge two things you said, Jordan. I've had both experiences, and I've had peak versions of both, and I can't find them ultimately distinguishable, like through a contemplative practice and taking a psychedelic. They have, and when you look at the research, people say they can be the same. They tend to orient a little bit differently. The psychedelic experience,
and it hasn't made John a theist. Sorry, John.
Psychedelic mystical experience tends to, on average, be a little bit more impersonal.
And that's where some of my skepticism lies, that and a number of people made that comment on Twitter and in comments that, well, for some Sam Harris types, it can sort of shake them out of a simplistic materialism. But it's not sufficient. It has to be, if the church is thinking that this is going to be an important part of figuring out how to deal with the hole in the culture that the church left behind, I don't necessarily see it.
The contemplative one tends to be a little bit, on average, more personal in the ontology, but no deep, differences. And the other thing I would say is, I don't know how much we have to rely on them. I take your point that it's instructive, and I think the science should do it. I think it's immoral to not investigate these substances because of the clear evidence that's mounting for their ability to alleviate, untreatable addiction, depression, a host of issues. And so,
and I on the pharmaceutical side, I agree with John Vervaeke there. I think these substances should be studied. When I read Michael Pollan's book, that the substances should be. We study all sorts of substances and the possibilities of helping people with them. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I also have a degree of, I see these as having a place in the whole scheme of things.
I think we should keep doing the science. But the research sort of reliably indicates that 30 to 40% of the population have these transformative experiences. That's what Taylor says. I think
someone made in the comment section, I don't remember who, or maybe it was on Twitter. No, it was Mark. It was Mark Lefevre, who writes, if you're not reading Mark's comments on my videos, you're missing out, because Mark will usually put together fairly meaty comments. Now, I know Mark's opinions are not to everybody's taste, and Mark, for being part of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis group, is about as hard on John Vervaeke as anyone. But the comments that Mark made with respect to psychedelics, I wanted to segment that in the other video, is not unlike the comments that I got from James Frazee, who is in our local meetup and has been on my channel and talks about how, for some people, experimenting with psychedelics is a disaster. And experimenting with pot can be a disaster, even alcohol for many people. So these substances are not benign. And so it's one thing if you've got some blue ribbon study at Johns Hopkins with all kinds of constraints around it done by, in a very controlled setting. It's another thing to just play with it because you think, oh, maybe this will help. Maybe it will and maybe it won't.
problem is not an absence of the experience. To go to Bishop Barron's point, I think it's the absence of a wisdom framework that allows people to properly appropriate and metabolize these experiences. So
I love those two words there, appropriate and metabolize. I thought that's right.
I'll do this in my class. I think I mentioned this to you, Jordan. With my students, I'll say, well, where do you go for information? The internet, blah, blah.
And again, in terms of my grading thing, in terms of who had the best performance in this conversation. This is every time I listen to John in this conversation, not to discount what other people have said. I'm not against Bishop Barron. I'm certainly not against Jonathan Pageau or Jordan Peterson, but I thought John made really salient points in this conversation that, they're on his side, but they temper his points. And so I thought it was very fair and wise.
Blah, blah, blah. Where do you go from knowledge, science, maybe the university? And I'll say, where do you go for wisdom? Mm-hmm. And there's a deafening silence.
Mm-hmm. That is the hole in our culture that the church left behind. Where do you go for wisdom? And so when I hear Jordan longing for a church that can do that he sees as an ally in his mission statement of helping individuals transform so that their potential can remake the world. And almost all of his complaints about the church. So there was another video that was just released. I know now you get to watch how the cake gets baked here. So you just did another one today. Oh, come on. No, not that one. Sorry. I should have just paused. The meaning and awe and conceptualization of God. That was 3 parts on the audio podcast, and 1 part here. One of the things that I did was I searched for every reference to the church, and you can search the transcripts there. And this is what he says about the church, all the way back to. You can go to YouTube. You can search Paul Vanderklay, Jordan Peterson, lying, pastor, all the way back to, let's say I made this video in January 2018. So, oh gosh, is it going to be 4 years next month? He did a question and answer where I guess I could probably just play some of it because I had thought about playing some of this. His journey in many ways grew out of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Think that it's particularly easy. The traditions bind the community together. Now I'm saying that, and I don't go to church, and the reason I don't go to church is because, well, it drives me crazy, to speak frankly. I haven't been able to sit in a situation like that ever since I was, ever, really. That's really the truth of it. Ever. I'm not convinced that that's a good thing, because I do believe, and I've had good conversations about this with Jonathan Pageau, I do believe that communal return to the source of the community's ethics is actually a necessary thing. And maybe I'm atoning for my past sins by doing these biblical lectures at the moment, which is something that's communal. So, and then because there's also something about going where a bunch of other people are to reaffirm your commitment to the good that you're all aiming at, that's got some power in it. And I don't think that that's something that we should forego. I think it's dangerous. I mean, look, even if you're cynical about church, and I guess I would put myself in that category, it's certainly the case that communal church going in the 1950s, say, provided the average person with at least an hour a week where they were contemplating, no matter how poorly, the purpose of ethics in life and the idea of a higher purpose and a higher meaning in life. And you got to think that spending an hour a week thinking about that is better than never doing it at all. So I don't know how that tradition can be revivified in a meaningful way, but I really do think it's a catastrophe that we've lost it, because we don't have a center, an ethical center that holds our community together, and the consequence of that is that we're fragmenting quite badly. So,
and that's the hole in the culture where the church used to be. and I think that's a classic Peterson answer. It's self-critical. It's very honest and transparent. And again, these are some of the qualities that I think have really brought a lot of people to appreciate and love. Now, and if you want to see one of the conversations that I'm actually most proud of, it's this conversation with Vaush that I thought was that this is of all the conversations I've had, this is definitely one of my favorites. I don't want to rank them necessarily, but I was sent all kinds of warnings by people before this. Don't talk to this guy. Then Adam Friended and PSA Sitch usually rake him over the coals regularly, but we had a very good faith conversation that I thought was very frank, and it was very good.
Mm-hmm. Right. And wisdom is not optional. Well, you know what? I don't care about being connected and overcoming self-deception and harming other people because of the ways in which I'm willfully. Of course, you can't. It's not optional. Wisdom is a necessity. It's an absolute prerequisite to religion. Yet our culture, right, has no way in general of providing people with the sapiential framework to
the hole in the middle of the culture where the church used to be.
Process these experiences, and also to have properly cultivated a prepared character for them when they do emerge. So I would argue that's where the problem lies. It's not in the absence, I think, of these experiences for people. It's the absence of a framework that allows, and a worldview that allows people to properly process them.
I haven't listened to all of there's been so much lately, all of the artful scaling of religion conversations between Layman Pascal and Brendan Graham Dempsey. Brendan Graham Dempsey did the video on meta modern, but again, this video is some thinking about the hole in the culture where the church used to be. And in some ways that's John Vervaeke's religion. That's not a religion.
I think we should come back to coherence and artistry and the things that might make a person stay turned on in a particular framing of their wisdom practices in order to get benefits from it. But two things have been coming up for me when you guys were talking. The first relates to this, pluralizing the training and explaining problem is an interesting way to go, because you have sets of practices that will be differently appropriate for different groups and differently amenable to them. Yeah. And then you also have all kinds of different types of translations that need to go on within explaining, because explaining is relative to who's hearing it and what the niche is, right? Maybe you want a very technical, mechanical explanation. Maybe you want a very poetic explanation. So we obviously need some kind of elite that can manage plural trainings and plural explainings. Yes. And the space between those things hopefully will be able to hold itself open and remain stable over time. The other part of it, when we were talking about the problematic element and the beneficial element of a broader usage of the terms, is that there needs to be some kind of verification process, right? Like our bodies are constantly taking in things good for us and things bad for us. And we have an immune system. We have a verification and vetting process. So you asked this earlier, John, how did the old world religions handle the problem of doing this? Because it's not problematic necessarily that people believe things that aren't technically correct. It's problematic if those things lead down the wrong pathways.
Yes.
So adjudicating between that, what did they use? Right. Obviously, Zen has this tradition of interviews where the master has to establish peer resonance with you and also problematize your state change experiences for you. Yeah. I think they had a lot of practices of social isolation, of transgression, of situations that sort of took a person outside of their normal social framing and experience of reality. Many of those obviously might have been too ascetic in certain ways. They might have been damaging or unhealthy. I think if we go much farther back, we find a pattern of the ritual humiliation of political and religious leaders, where there were things done to make fun of or take them outside of their context so that we don't mistake what's going on in the local practical structure for some kind of reified status. And we could take all of those things and more, because we could make a bigger list, and we could add to them a contemporary notion of a therapeutic adjunct to spiritual and religious and wisdom practice training.
I think so. That's very good. Even and the topic of the elites, and then the practices by which the elites did not become reified or deified. I think that's important. So a connection I want to make to that, which is again to deepen the problem. We had three interlocking institutions, right, where we had the university, the monastery, and the church. And they were all trying to manage the training, explaining, and the elite versus the laity relationship. Like one of the functions of the church was to presumably, right, manage between the elites and the laity. I'm just using that as neutral a term as I can. And the monastery concentrated a lot on training for wisdom, and the university concentrated much more on explaining for scientia. I don't mean just science, but I mean knowledge in general. So you had knowledge, and you had wisdom, and you had something like, I don't quite know what to call it. Maybe it's not quite understanding, but it's this, maybe it's this social integration, social cohesion thing you were talking about, Layman. And I'm wondering, is that just happenstance, or and because you can see similar things, right? Even in the Zen situation, you have the Zen monastery, but you have the Zen temple. And then you have things like the Kyoto school, where Zen is taken up within basically an academic setting and developed in powerful ways. I might be just seeing a taxonomy because I'm just imposing it because I'm overly Platonic in my orientation to reality. But I'm wondering if that's happenstance, or if that's part of have institutions to some degree worked out an ecology of institutions in order to address the pedagogical pluralism problem and the conveyor belt and the explaining training problem. Does that mean that the religion that's not a religion would need something like that? And Layman, that's important, because what it means is we actually have we have kinds of elites, if I can put it that way. And they have, this sounds ridiculously American, but they sort of have checks and balance relationships with each other as a way of managing some of the issues, right? So the monasteries tend to home people that are much more mystically oriented, right? And the church was people who are much more sort of missionary oriented, if I can put it that way. And then the university is people who are much more sort of philosophically oriented. And they're all sort of acting as checks and balances on each other. And they put terrific strain in the history of Christianity on the institution. But it seems to me that's one of the ways that the old world religions, I like that metaphor, by the way, Layman, the way I said old religions and you changed it into old world religions, which is really wonderful. Thank you for that. That's beautiful. That's really good. Is that one of the ways in which they address this problem, right? Because I'm trying to get back, this is Brendan's question, is like, how do we structure this? And is it that each one of these is doing different things? Maybe the church concentrates on narrative, and maybe the monastery concentrates on something like transcendence, or right, and then the university, of course, concentrates on theory. I'm sorry, I'm really waving my hands because I'm trying to look back and trying to address what both of you are saying and see if I can draw anything from that history that might be helpful here.
Well, and these institutions grew for a reason, and the growth of the university, and even if you just follow the history of the university, George Marsden has written on the secularization of the American university, because most of the universities in America, most of the private universities in America, the historical ones, were started as religious organizations, and they were there to train clergy. They were there to, in the Christian Reformed Church, they were there to train Christian day school. They were there to equip and to train the church. And so they had their function in there. And that has been, in many ways, disrupted and displaced now.
And we've had a few centuries of Christianity really kind of falling into the trap of materialism, first of all, trying to constantly justify its stories through history and some statuette found in Palestine or whatever, like all these strategies to try to constantly justify the stories through these scientific methods. And at the same time, focusing on the idea of being saved or going to hell and going to heaven, rather than the more mystical tradition, which is there. It's all there, right? It's all there and it's all available to us. It's just that the emphasis has been, I think, the wrong one in the past few centuries.
And this is where I push back on some of my Christian brothers here, where it's all there in the way that it's all there in the library and it's all there on the internet. It has to be there in the flesh. And that's why you need your monasteries and your churches and your universities or whatever new institutions will develop to take the roles of these as we continue to move forward in history.
But it is possible, and I think it's happening now. And like Bishop Barron said, I think, Jordan, one of the things you're forcing a lot of Christians to do is to reconsider what this has to do with my life, how it binds it together, how it connects us together. And we have the church fathers that just right there, it's all there in their teaching. And it's there in the liturgy itself, and the imagistic vision of the chants and the iconography, and all of this it's all present. We just need to kind of go back and help people connect things together so that they can have true experiences.
But we forgot a lot of our own tradition, or we underplayed it. I'll give you one example. When I was coming of age in the Catholic Church, so you're now late 70s into the 80s, the way we were instructed in the Bible, so those of us preparing for the priesthood, right, to be preachers and to be spiritual counselors and soul doctors, it was pure historical criticism. That was a method of biblical approach that...
And he's exactly right. And so I then went through seminary in the 80s, and it was already turning towards literary criticism, which was far and away more helpful in terms of understanding meaning in the text, because I would look at a lot of the stuff from the grammatical historical, and it was very difficult as a preacher to figure out how to apply this to people. And so, I mean, Bishop Barron is correct there, but in all fairness to those who went down you had the modernist fundamentalist fight. I mean, there was modernity was completely reshaping the world, and the church was trying to adapt. And so then maybe there's the strategy of the Orthodox to not change versus, the Roman Catholic to change somewhat, and Protestants, which are all the way on one side of really trying to not change, and all the way on the other side of really trying to change a lot, and all the modes in between.
Emphasize very much, what was in the mind of the human author as he wrote. And so using very rationalistic methods to kind of break the scriptures down, break them apart. But the whole idea of meaning, about what the scriptures were telling us about God, about our relation to God, the mystical dimension of life, that was all very muted. As a result, our preaching, and I accuse my own generation of this, our preaching became very flat, often very politicized, maybe psychologized in the worst sense of that term. But the mystical depth of the scripture, we forgot. We didn't read the church fathers Jung himself said the first psychologists were the church fathers. It's dead right, it seems to me. So we share a lot of this blame here. By we, I mean the religions themselves. We forgot our own best traditions, and we allowed this scientism to hold sway. And that's why people are struggling.
So I've been trying to figure out...
See, and I don't think it's that simple. That's certainly a piece of the problem. And I'm not saying he's saying it's that simple, but that is an aspect. Yet the church had to deal with modernity, and it tried to do so. And now modernity is leaving, so it's fairly comfortable to say, oh, we've got to get back to what we were doing before modernity. And the benefit of churches is that, especially of the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic, is because they've got that material. So when Jonathan Pageau says the church fathers are right there, and Bishop Barron says the fathers are right there, and we've got the tradition, and they're right. And Protestants a little high and dry in that area, but then we tend to just default back to the others.
I mean, I really don't know how to... I'm stunned at the popularity of the biblical lectures. I can't wrap my head around it, no matter how hard I try. And I can't even judge their significance. So small or great, but they've attracted a lot of views. So we'll stick with that. So then, assuming that they have some significance, I've tried to figure out, well, what was it that made them work? Why did people come and listen?
Yeah, because it might not work the second time. I mean, the timing is different. I mean, who knows? Who knows if he does Exodus, whether that will. It's always when where the registers meet.
Listen to what I was saying about about Genesis, and I think partly it was because I wasn't exactly telling people what I thought about them. I wasn't saying this is how you should read these stories. I was trying to investigate something I knew was beyond my comprehension. And I was doing that on my feet. Now, I talked to someone this week who is quite explicitly religious, and I could hardly listen to him because he kept telling me what was right. He kept telling me the dogma. It's like, well, are you so sure you know that? And like, who the hell are you?
Remember the place in the Cambridge Union where I said, remember this because it's going to come up in here? Right here. Well, maybe I can find it. No, I don't want to look.
You to tell me that. And it just, there was just no meaning being revealed from that. There was no investigation. Like, I approached the Bible as a psychologist in some sense, but as if it was something.
Okay, and right there. So we have the hole in the culture where the church used to be. And the answer we tend to get from religious people, and I'm one of them, okay, is, well, let's just switch it right back in there. And for some people, in terms of their individual life, absolutely. Absolutely. So, John Vervaeke, I couldn't find exactly which conversation. There have been so many. I mean, he's made very clear that for individuals that he knows who find their way back to the religion that they grew up in, he sees that as, obviously that's going to address their meaning crisis. When I talk about the meaning crisis to people who are well within inside the church under absolutely no threat of deconstruction, they're always sort of like, what meaning crisis? They are within, there is no hole in the culture for them. It fits right in. But this is, so again, the one comment in the first video, and I wish it were easier to go back and find YouTube comments that I think are really good. Sometimes I screen capture them because some of your comments that you leave on my videos are tremendous. And lately when I do these kinds of commentary videos, they get way more views and I can't keep up with the comments. And many of the comments are exceptional and really very wonderful. But, one of the persons said, well, he's there making the point of the church. And this is, for the church to be a living organism, it has to just, in some ways, sit right there on chaos and order. It has to be right there in the middle of it. And that's one of the things that Peterson got right. And so what that means in an estuary group is there's going to be chaos and order. That's those of you, some of you figured this out already. The salt water and the fresh water, the water coming down from the mountain, the water coming in from the sea, the sea monsters in the sea, the order up on the top of the hierarchy where the fresh water is coming from. This estuary is the meeting of chaos and order in many ways. And so part of what Peterson is complaining about, why he, on one hand, is lamenting the hole in the culture where the church used to be, while at the same time not going back into that hole and filling it back in with the churches, he says, I'm not seeing the kind of dynamic encounter and journeying that is disruptive enough to the order, but in a fruitful way. And that's terrifying in the church because we don't want to lose found knowledge. But at the same time in the church, we usually hopefully in our better days, acknowledge that our found knowledge and wisdom is always limited and subject to improvement. But the improvement can't be disorderly. It has to be productive and in the span of things you don't know. And so it's only over long amounts of time that, orthodoxy and heterodoxy sort of co-generate at the same time. And it's only in a long period of time where you begin to see orthodoxy manifesting itself and understanding. And I mean very long periods of time, much longer than our short little lives, which is why the church is always a vital center and why its absence is missed. Missed in terms of wisdom, missed in terms of meaning, missed in terms of knowledge, missed in terms of a healthy society, missed in terms of how do we make decisions about good, bad, right, and wrong and morality, missed. There's a reason, there's a hole in the culture where the church used to be. And we know we need to we need something in that place again. And so Jordan, John has his religion that's not a religion, and Jordan is, has his project of individual salvation, of proximal betterment. But again, I look at that and say it's not going to be enough. And I think John Vervaeke is aware of that with the scaling problem and the issues involved with that.
Something I really didn't understand, a strange artifact. God only knows that. There was no investigation. Like, I approached the Bible as a psychologist in some sense, but as if it was something I really didn't understand, a strange artifact. God.
And he always says as a psychologist, but never just as a psychologist. Jordan clearly is approaching it with his whole person. And sometimes he'll, make that disclaimer, but I think part of why it was living was he engaged it with his whole person. And notice he caught the attention not just of low status people like me, but others who have more status in religious institutions.
God only knows what it is. It's this book that's been around forever. It cobbled itself together in a manner we can't understand. It's lasted for a very, very long period of time. It's had an inestimable impact. It's full of extraordinarily strange stories that we understand very little about in some profound sense. And it was an investigation, and I kind of pulled people along with me during the investigation, and that seemed to, and maybe when I go to church,
and that's, I'm not going to compare my adult Sunday school classes to his biblical series because they're very different beasts, but that's what I try to do in Bible studies and in small groups is, we're on a journey together to listen to this book and to feed off of this book and to take this book into ourselves.
Do I see that? Do I feel that I'm being led along an investigation into the structure of deep meaning? And the answer is not usually. I usually feel as if I'm being told what to think or told what to believe. And
now I have to find it.
But that's way different than saying, well, here's what you should do. And the problem with here's what you should do is, first of all, as the psychoanalyst knew, you just set up resistances in people. And the reason, so they won't do it, even if they want your advice. And often they'll do the opposite, just out of spite. And probably they should, because they're basically saying, up yours. It's like, this is my life, man, not yours. And the other problem with advice is, well, let's say you take my advice and then you go do something good. It's like, well, whose victory is that? Is it yours or mine? So did I just steal your victory? Well, that's not so good.
And you can make a good living on YouTube doing exactly that, because there's always the tribe, your little tribe of the already convinced that just simply loves to hear you win, loves to hear you dunk on someone on the internet. And there are places in video to make the point of being right and make the argument where the ecosystem is fed with people making their case strongly. I have no problem with that. But when it comes to making our points face to face, it's so much better to treat each other like people.
that doesn't seem to work.
But the church fathers preached in
what it's
exactly the
worth.
way you're describing. And we luckily have some of these sermons, like of Augustine, that he gave, we'd say, off the cuff. There was a secretary out in the crowd who would take them down.
And if you want little bits of Augustine sermons on Twitter, follow Eric Dirksen. I'm not sure. There's a sense in which I agree with his point here, and there's a wildness to the church that you find in Augustine and many others. But it's a. I've been listening again to Through the Eye of the Needle, which is this really fascinating book by Peter Brown on the history of the church and money in late antiquity, and it's so instrumental in figuring out just the complexity and it's a radical difference of why John Vervaeke talks about stealing the culture. That would be a book worth reading in terms of that investigation, because it just shows all of the layers. All of us talking on the internet isn't going to cut it. It's just deeply true.
He would probably polish them later, but you get a sense of someone who's doing what you're saying. I think thinking through with the text as he goes. He was theologizing, philosophizing, but he was trying to draw his people. He was a pastor, Augustine. He wasn't an academic. He wasn't a professor of theology at a university. He was a pastor trying to draw his people closer to God. And you
look at someone like Cyprian. He's a politician, Cyprian, and they didn't have the kind of developed formal institutions and structures we have today. For a whole variety of reasons. The world is different. Old world religion. I like that phrasing of it from that Vervaeke scaling video too.
He learned the method, by the way, from Ambrose. When he goes to Ambrose in Milan, he's a Manichae. He's not even a Christian. But he heard.
And Ambrose is an interesting critter. Just caught here in the book, in 374, Ambrose stepped straight from the governorship to a see in Milan with the support of none other than Petronius Probus, the Roman magnate of legendary wealth and tentacular influence, whom we met in chapter 1. And in 393 in distant Spain, Priscillian became Bishop of Avila, again through the support of wealthy zealots. It's and then of course to have the question of in the late Middle Ages, at the context of the Protestant Reformation, the relationship between government and church, radically different than what we see today. I've been reading this fascinating book by John O'Malley on Vatican I, the church and the making of the Ultramontane Church. It's a fascinating book, a lot of history about the struggles in France between Gallicanism and Ultramontanism, which is, the ideas of papal infallibility. We've been working on the questions of what should be at the center of a culture for a very long time. And with the span having gotten so much larger than what you see, let's say, in Old Testament Israel and what we try to know there, all the way out into these, enormous states and churches, it's a huge issue.
I heard that Ambrose was a great rhetorician, so he went to hear his rhetoric. And while he was there, he learned the method of reading the Bible, which is this more allegorical, spiritual method. That's what Jung appreciated. That's what you're doing in many ways. The young Augustine learned it from Ambrose, and then he bequeathed that to us in his sermons and biblical commentaries. But trust me when I tell you, we didn't study that. We didn't study that approach. Ours was a very scientific, rationalistic approach to the Bible, and that's why preaching is relatively bad, I would say. So you've, in a way, stumbled on something that's very old, but still has enormous power to transform people.
There's also
it's not, but there's a sense in which that answer tempts us to imagine, I'll just do like Augustine. And some would argue that Augustine is, a very early psychologist if you just read Augustine's Confessions, but it's going to be different. And the fact that Peterson did it in the Bader Theater, and now he's going on another book tour, and it's going to be different because the world is different. And this is where, this isn't somewhere where I'm sort of caught between the two sides of, let's see if I can get it, dyslexic me, the two sides of here, where on one hand, yes, I'm a Protestant. I mean, that's exactly where Protestants are sort of caught up and down the difference here.
Something important, Jordan, in understanding that at least the traditional churches, at least the liturgical churches, that you don't them, like, for example, in the Orthodox Church, they always...
Here it comes. See, and again, this was the teaser at the beginning of the video. But when you hear it in this context, it's different than when you hear it at the beginning of the video and it's this teaser. It's like, it's slap. What are you, slapping the Protestants around now? Come on, Jonathan.
I always say, if the sermon is more than 15 minutes, it's pride. It's like, keep your sermons as short as possible, because you're not there to encounter...
Obviously.
2 weeks in a row, I've kept my sermon short here at Living Stones. Don't expect it to last too long.
Guilty of that.
You're not there. I mean, it's propositional understanding is fine, but it's participatory, right? Church is participatory. So you enter into the church, like you imagine an Orthodox...
And that's part of the reason that I've always loved Bible studies, my adult Sunday school class, where let's have a conversation. Let's go back and forth. Let's listen to each other. Now again, that doesn't scale well. I'm surprised how well it scaled on YouTube, but it's not always terribly gripping to listen to somebody else's conversations. There are many people, and you can't give your devotion to each the same.
Church, even a traditional Catholic church, you have a space which is structured as the hierarchy, ontological hierarchy of being. And then you see these images which are patterned and are revealing to you these mysteries that are beyond words. And then you participate in this singing, these processions, and it is a participative thing. And so if you go there to kind of get knowledge, it's not the same type of practice. And as you're singing these songs and as you're hearing these hymns, all of a sudden two images connect together. And all of a sudden, these things start to connect inside you in almost a kind of super rational way. And they're very deep, and they're embodied as you bow down, as you kneel, as you eat the body and blood of Christ. These are different types of participation than just...
And Jonathan, I'm totally in agreement with you. And what did we do in our Catholic churches in the West? The same time we were presenting the Bible in this flattened out historical critical way, we also were flattening out our churches, emptying out our churches of just that mystical cosmic symbolism, the angels, the saints, color, the cosmic dimension, and we flattened them out and we made them like empty meeting spaces. So,
and again, I agree with him, but again, back to the Audrey Assad, she went from Plymouth Brethren, Derby dispensationalism to Roman Catholic and left that. That's helpful. We need to bring in the mystical and the mythical, but the scale issue is all the way across the board. So again, I agree and more.
So there was a terrible rationalism that descended upon the church, and it dried us up in many ways. This is, again, my mea culpa as a Catholic. I think we passed through a period that was really problematic. And recovering the sources, ressourcement, we say, right? Recovering the great sources of the Bible and the fathers. That's what we're talking about. What the Bible had by its nature, what the fathers understood, that's what we need to revive the church, I think.
Now, in case you haven't seen this one, the Collective Intelligence, Angels in Scientific Terms, another outstanding video. But this was interesting because, again, I've said what I've said about Barron, but I thought this shed a lot of light on it too, and I really appreciated Jonathan's thought.
And it's interesting because with adding Bishop Barron, the conversation definitely morphed into something completely different.
Yes.
Because he's not involved in this kind of the way that we've been talking about religion, let's say for the past several years, you and I and Jordan in our different ways, but kind of coming towards similar ideas about phenomenology, or in your sense, more kind of cog sci, and Jordan's evolutionary approach. All of this is kind of coming towards something. And Bishop Barron is just dropping out from outside with a more kind of Catholic, Thomist and Augustinian way of thinking. So for me, that was one of the most interesting things, was to watch the discussion move toward the direction where all of a sudden I could see in Bishop Barron's eyes that he was like, oh, this is like, there's something else going on here. There's another type of discussion.
Yeah, he just wrote. I just read it this morning. I didn't read it thoroughly. I just read parts of it. He wrote a blurb, a blog.
Grizz tried looking that up. It's on Word on Fire, Grizz. That's Bishop Barron's. That's Bishop Barron's space.
About he was very clearly appreciative in all three senses of the word of the discussion, and so I think your observation is accurate.
So look, but Bishop, you're doing something right. Obviously, you're attracting some online attention, some substantial online attention. And Jonathan, the same is true of you. And well, John, it goes without saying for you to some degree, because you're a professor and you have that whole, that whole world at your fingertips in some sense. And you've been
poor John.
Very successful at that. But in the more specifically religious domain, the more specifically Christian domain, you two are having some public success. What are you doing right, do you think?
I'll let Jonathan go first.
I
think Bishop Barron and I are doing very similar things, which is why I've always felt akin to what he's doing. I've written for one of his publications. I always felt we're close in the approach, which is, first of all, avoiding just argumentation, but rather this kind of presentation of beauty. Bishop Barron also, even in his publications, this desire to kind of have a beauty first approach, this kind of encounter with these powerful patterns of being, and how they kind of point to Christ. And I think that showing the deep coherence, the deep narrative coherence in Scripture, and then pointing back out to the world and saying, this deep coherence in Scripture, you're going to encounter it in movies and in all these cultural phenomena that you're going to see. You're going to encounter the same deep patterns that you find in Scripture at a lower level, we could say, but that all of these kind of culminate into, and so it really is like a meaning first approach and a beauty first approach, I think, which is attracting people, because the insights they get at first, they can't. I have people who watch my videos for 2 years and tell me they don't understand what I'm saying. And I'm like, well, why are you watching how can you have been watching my videos for 2 years if you don't understand? And they seem to express that they get these insights and they can't totally explain them. And then it keeps them kind of wanting to continue on on this path, let's say, towards, ultimately, a lot of them end up moving towards Christianity and entering a church at some point.
See, I think Jonathan's, what Bishop Barron has been doing online has been a little bit more standard in terms of late modern apologetics, church instruction. And again, I'm not criticizing it. There are a lot of ways in which I look at what Bishop Barron has been doing and I think, wow, I wish I could do it like him, because some of what he does is just so good. In another sense, I think what Pageau said to John Vervaeke at the beginning of that conversation that they had is also true, that things are moving on. And I see Justin Brierley taking the turn. I think Justin Brierley has really been taking the turn and seeing this is entering a new phase. And I think probably for Bishop Barron, watching Jordan Peterson, getting an eye on, knowing Pageau a little bit more and more, and being introduced to John Vervaeke, he's a very smart man. I mean, please, all the stuff I've said here does not take away from the vast respect I have for him just as a Roman Catholic priest, because, in some ways any old dope can slide in to be a Protestant minister in some ways, and a lot of dopes do. He's got skin in the game. I mean, he's a bishop, and there's a lot of respect that I have for someone who reaches that level, and his academic credentials, what he's done with his channel. When people listen to me, they're always taking shots at Bishop Barron. By no means. Yet what's happening here is new and important, and it's going to take a while for people to begin to recognize it, because, again, the world is changing, and, Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and Vervaeke and this little corner on the internet, we're kind of at the cusp of it. And so for people deep within institutions, hierarchies bind and blind. And it'll take them a little while to sort of figure it out. And then they've got a whole institution. I mean, people watch my channel and they think, oh, what must Sunday morning be like? Well, Sunday morning is for a church, mostly people over 80. I'm not going to talk about these kind of things with them. Not directly. Little stuff will get put into it. But, in some ways, I need to bury my church before I can move on in some ways. But you'll see that in my adult Sunday school class. I'll put little things in because that's, I know as a pastor, this is the pace you need to go. And, what we're doing on YouTube right now, this is all just very experimental and very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my thing has been beauty and truth. I mean, so don't dumb it down. I lived through dumbed down Catholicism, and it was a pastoral disaster. You look at all the surveys. I studied them very carefully, why young people are leaving. The scandals come up. The scandals will be mentioned, but by far the most prominent reason is I don't believe the doctrines. I never had my questions answered. It's in conflict with science. It doesn't make sense.
And that's very much closer to what Audrey Assad is saying in the Justin Brierley conversation. And one of the things I respect about Justin Brierley, always have, is that he lets people have the conversation. He's not there trying to, correct or cajole, Audrey Assad. He's just listening to her. And so, I think Justin has taken the turn quicker. And so, okay, so the Orthodox and the Catholics have maintained their sacraments and maintained their beauty and maintained their art. And Protestants struggle with that, but Protestants have other gifts and skills that we bring into this too. And it's a very big, very live space.
Intellectual problems. Well, yeah, I get it. We dumbed the project down for about 50 years. So smarten it up and reintroduce people to this tradition we've been talking about. The second thing is the beautiful. We also, as we dumbed it down, we also uglified it. We de-emphasized the beautiful. So one example, we put out this Word on Fire Bible. So the text of the Gospels, but it's a bit like an illuminated manuscript idea that we surrounded it with glosses from the fathers and the popes and the great theologians, but also lots of artwork, lots of color. So I want to reintroduce people to the Bible, but not in a flat rationalistic way, So that's what I've been trying to do.
I was certainly attracted to Jonathan to begin with because of the quality of his artistic endeavor. Right, these absolutely beautiful.
Everybody's attracted to Jonathan.
Your hair and scalp can't take the heat. Myth. The fact is, Head & Shoulders Ocean Lift with Sea Mineral Essence formula keeps your scalp and hair invigorated and 100% flake-free through the hottest summer days.
Brought to you by our friends at Symbolic Mimes.
And archaic endeavor. Right, these absolutely beautiful and archaic, traditional, let's say, not archaic, traditional medium that he was revitalizing in such a stunningly beautiful way. And that was the entry point into getting to know him and getting to understand his thought. And and beauty isn't the thing.
Better than those churchmen telling Jordan what to believe and their dogma and their doctrine.
You can't argue against today. Yeah. Beauty just smacks you, and that's really something. So, and you can also help people notice that. It's like, well, notice beauty brooks no argumentation.
Right.
What do you think that signifies? What's it pointing to?
Yeah.
Is it pointing to something higher? It certainly seems to. What might be higher? We need to figure that out.
Well, it's the least threatening of the transcendentals in the postmodern context. So people today, you say, here's something that's true.
And I loved this point. Okay, so all of you who think I hate on Bishop Barron, I loved this point. This was big points for Barron.
True. Who are you going to tell me what's true? I got my own truth. Even worse, here's the way you ought to live. Here's the good. Who are you to tell me how to live? But the beautiful doesn't preach in that negative sense. It just is. It shows itself. So it's more winsome. I think it's a less threatening way into the project. So that's why I've tried to lead with it.
Especially in a world that's so ugly. Like our world is just so ugly. The modern world is just so banal that there's a reason why tourists go to cities and visit churches, even though they're not Christian and they don't care about it, because they go someplace and they're looking for beauty, and then they end up in a church rather than in a mall.
Yeah, and that's definitely worth thinking about, and the incredible value that's to be found in those unbelievably beautiful constructions. It's like, what is that beauty? And why do we experience it there? Those lattice-like creations of stone and crystal with color, and the addition of the music. That all goes to your liturgical point, the drama that's part of that, and the celebration of beauty.
Chartres
Which
Cathedral.
is definitely absent in the modern culture. Yes.
Yeah. When I was a student in Paris, I'd go there all the time. And Chartres to me is the most beautiful covered space in the world. But I remember this years ago, I brought a classmate of mine, so a priest from Chicago, to see Chartres. And we walked through it and I explained everything. We looked at the windows and all this.
Another good story by Barron. See, he gets points later in the game.
And he said, gosh, it's something. It's just too bad it's so liturgically off. And I knew what he meant because I was formed in the same way. The church should be in the round so we could see each other, and there should be clear sight lines, and it should be brightly lit and all this stuff. I'm like, man, you just said Chartres Cathedral is liturgically off? It's like it's the supreme liturgical space in the world. But that shows the quality of the bad quality of the formation that we got in my generation.
My experience with Christianity has been different. So I was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian family. And so I very much was traumatized by that. And I think if you talk to some of the nuns, NONESs, I think there's a mixture. Like you said, I don't think the scandals, which the media likes to focus on, are not the primary factors.
Right.
It's not what the research shows. One is this issue about intelligibility, and I want to talk about that. And the other is I meet a lot of people are attracted to my work because they've had similar histories. Not just specific to Christianity. I'm not beating up on Christianity. I've had people coming out of other traditions, Islamic, Buddhist. This is possible in all of the traditions I've encountered. So I think there's two things I want to say, and they're not intended to be pushback, but
now you can find on YouTube my initial conversation I had with John Vervaeke. Who is John Vervaeke and what is the meaning crisis? What he shared with Sam here on Sam's channel I thought was really moving and pertinent to the conversation of the Four Horsemen.
So, I mean, I encountered Plato. I'd gone through a sort of I'd left a fundamentalist Christian upbringing and became sort of a virulent, almost Sam Harris kind of, or at least maybe Richard Dawkins. I think maybe Sam is softening over time. Richard Dawkins, kind of militant atheist, but the hunger I had for deep connectedness. So for all of the ways in which my religious upbringing, I think it's fair to say, traumatized me, it also left a taste in my mind for something larger than myself, deeper than myself. And then when I read Plato in the first year of university, and I encountered the figure of Socrates, and I read The Republic, which is one of the most expansive of Plato's dialogue, and I just fell in love with it. So I continued on with philosophy, but after you get past sort of first year philosophy, even though the word philosophy contains the word wisdom literally in it, the topic of wisdom falls off the table. And so I pursued academic philosophy because I got an interest in, epistemology and metaphysics for their own sake. The meta science, philosophy of science became really important to me. And so I continued on, but that hunger for wisdom was not properly being addressed. They're intended to open up questions, which is, and this is where Jonathan and I also, we rub up against each other, but it usually creates a good friction and good sparks. And maybe it'll call forth a response for you too, Bishop. I think the project is not to try and resurrect Neoplatonism or the Neoplatonic structure. Augustine wasn't only, taught by Ambrose. He explicitly talked about, Plotinus and the Platonists and the mystical experience, the Neoplatonic mystical experience he had, and how important that was, etc. And it's clear that it's through Pseudo Dionysius and Maximus, and so so I think the project, if I were to put it, if we want to reach the nuns, is to show them a reconciliation, a profound one. And here my ambition runs, not personally, but the ambition of the project, towards Aquinas or Maximus, which is to show, to revise that Neoplatonism, and perhaps it's a Neoplatonic Christianity, but I'm not going to be specific about that right now, to show how it is profoundly, to do a reciprocal reconstruction between the Neoplatonism and the scientific worldview. And there's a lot of people doing that right now. I think we need a post-nominalist Neoplatonism, if I could put it that way, in a profound.
John, you opened that salvo with the statement that you were traumatized by the fundamentalist Christianity.
Yes, very much.
And that's not irrelevant to the salvo and to the nature of your project. And it's something we should discuss too. Because you also brought up the idea of reconciliation. So people have left the church, but in some sense, the church has alienated people from it as well. And some of that's the scandal, and some of it's the sort of experience that you describe.
Yes.
People have been left with the horrors of childhood experience that were a consequence of their religious education. And I'm not believe me, I'm not trying to attack the institutions per se, but it's...
Again, there's a hole in the culture where the church used to be, and I think Jordan and John are feeling that, and they're watching the collapse. There is no institutional structure in the culture that is functioning for the culture as a whole.
Something that they need to deal with. It needs to be dealt with. It all of us need to deal with. Not they. There's no they here. You know what there's no they here. We have these problems. We have this meaning crisis. It's everyone's problem. So there's no they in some sense. But so what has that done to you, let's say, with regards to your appreciation of Christianity per se?
Well, first of all, I want to say that those two things that we talked about, the one that Bishop Barron brought up about, and my response to it is, I think we need, and maybe Jonathan will have a response because he has this model of Christianity going through a resurrection cycle itself. So maybe there is a possibility for our discussion here. But I think we need a reciprocal reconstruction. We need a post-nominalist form of Neoplatonism that will provide that bridging. And I do not think, Jordan, that the lack of that is unrelated to the trauma that I experienced. Because there was no bridge.
Take that apart.
Yeah, exactly.
Take that apart.
Okay. Because there was no bridge, it was easy to give me an either or isolating choice. You're either in this worldview or you're in that worldview, and that one's demonic. And if you go over there, you're lost. There is a deep connection between the lack of bridge between the religious worldview, if I can put it that way, and the scientific worldview that allowed for that kind of tyranny over my mind that I found so deeply traumatizing. Those are not separable phenomena. That's what I'm arguing. They are deeply interpenetrating and mutually supporting.
It's generally seen as quite a fundamentalist in a sense, sort of particular.
Although I will say in England and Australia, I think it's gone to a more extreme direction than typically is the case here. But there are those tendencies here, and because it's an anti-hierarchical denomination, they're pretty autonomous from each other. These assemblies, as they're called here. So you could have
and in right there, you see some of the back and forth of. Is a hierarchy what we want? We want control so we can make sure we don't have local aberrations? Or do you want it to be non-prescriptive so that it's anybody can do? And as I listen to conversations both in the church space and also in sort of the rebel wisdom, John Vervaeke space, well, there's a real fear about a hierarchical, prescriptive path, but these things always have their upsides and downsides.
I have a very different experience from one to the next, which I'm super aware of because I have friends that grew up in it that had a very different experience than I did because the culture of that particular gathering was different because it doesn't have, there's no bishops and, there's no pope. It's a similar to a Quaker type of spirituality in that way, and in other ways as well. But so that's where I was raised, and so it's a small fundamentalist cult-like upbringing, which I'm now aware, after having done years of work to try to untangle the angst I have felt over religion and spirituality. A lot of it starts with that upbringing, and I remember in particular just being terrified all the time of everything, it
was remarkable when John has spoken about his upbringing in other places and the parallels between some of what I heard Audrey Assad say and some of what John has said. Because again, for me, I was raised in a deeply religious household, and my father was a pastor, my grandfather is a pastor, and I was raised in a house where exploration and pursuit of the truth and discovery was these were what we did, and we were never in fear that Jesus wouldn't be on the other end of it. And
of physical affection, let's say, I was so scared of that. I mean, I read my journals. I have all these journals from when I was in middle school and high school, and I would write things about how holding hands leads to kissing, which leads to what, and you can't ever do that, and it's bad. And I definitely internalized things in a certain way, and I'm not going to blame that on the people teaching me. I think it was a mix of what was taught and my particular temperaments. And I also now know that I have been managing OCD my whole life, which I didn't know at the time. And so I was sort of diagnosed with this form of OCD called scrupulosity or religious OCD about 5 or 6 years ago. And that really cast a lot of light and illumination on my relationship to faith, because I don't think it's easy for me to operate independently of that tendency. So organized religion for me always carried a challenge around not being able to be terrified of hell and doing the wrong thing, hurting someone, hurting God.
Did your kind of experience of Christianity ever kind of turn into something more grace-filled? I mean, I know you eventually kind of took a journey towards Catholicism. Could you
Definitely.
talk about that
And
briefly?
I would say currently I still have a relationship to Christianity. I mean, I don't think there's a way for me not to do that, and I don't desire to not have a relationship to it actually. And I'll say more about this later, but when I announced that I'm not currently practicing, that is the material truth of it. I don't mean to say that I hate it or that I could never practice it again, or that I hate Jesus, because I honestly don't think any of those things are necessarily the truth. But I am where I am partially because I need to be here. It's sort of, well, I guess wholly because I feel that I need to be where I am. And
that's how I experienced it. And what opened me up was a science fiction book that showed, it was a book by Roger Zelazny, Lord of Light, that showed the possibility of wonder and self-transcendence within a scientific worldview. That's what blew me open out of fundamentalism.
Yeah, well, lots of people who are followers of scientism, let's say, find their religion in science fiction.
Totally.
That's where literature grabs them, right? That's where they're grabbed by the religious. And I mean, Star Wars is the classic example of that, for sure.
Definitely.
So, and that's worth pointing out to these rationalist atheists.
That's fascinating to me.
Fun
when I deal with atheists online, which I do a lot, very often I'd say when you scratch the surface of a really angry atheist, you'll find, as you put it, a traumatized fundamentalist. At first that surprised me. Now it doesn't anymore. That when I press a little bit and probe a little bit, it's someone recovering from just the kind of traumatizing experience that you had as a kid. So that makes sense to me.
I want to be clear. I wouldn't self-identify as an atheist. That would
No, I wasn't suggesting that. No, but I think just to your point that I understand the severe reaction to it that people would have.
What did you think of the point that I made that there's a deep connection between sort of the psychological trauma and the fact that it was facilitated by this gap between right religion and science that is very much the Enlightenment grammar that we've been given, right? And see, what I find attractive about the Neoplatonic tradition was the idea of rationality and the mystical being deeply interpenetrating. But we can't leave it as it was, is what I. Well,
no,
that's
sure.
I think it needs a fundamental reorganize, and it needs to connect to this there's a huge thing happening in science, at least the science where the fundamental ontology is coming into question the way we have seen since the beginning of the 20th century. There's a golden opportunity here.
What do you see happening?
How would you say your relationship is now to the person of Christ, Audrey? You've spoken a little bit about God kind of not being quite such a hard and fast being as such, giving commandments and laws and so on. Where do you put Christ in that?
So several years ago, I got very interested in quantum physics. And of course, I'm a layperson. I'm not a physicist. I don't really have a sophisticated understanding of quantum physics, but it's very interesting to me. So I read a lot about it. Because one of the questions I always lived with as a Christian, as a child, was like, how am I communicating to God? And how am I communicating to Jesus? Like, what does it mean that he's everywhere? What does that mean practically? I don't understand how that's possible. We don't believe in ghosts, we wouldn't call Jesus a ghost. How is it possible for a God and a man to permeate not only space and time, but like all of space and time?
I think there's a ton of God number one, God number two. Maybe I'll do a separate video on it in this conversation. I thought this was one of the more helpful reconstruction, deconstruction. Sorry, Chris Foley made liked one of the comments I made about this on Twitter. So I don't mean to diss Chris Foley in that. And, but some of the parallels of this deconstruction conversation with the other conversation, I thought were noteworthy.
I mean, what are you seeing? Because you're far seeing, so I want to know, like, what is it that you're picking up?
Oh boy, I don't know. I want to take that, but thank you for that. Well, what I see is this. I see that we're moving back to the understanding that we need the emanation with the emergence. Not throwing out the emergence, but we need the emanation with it. Let me just give you one example. So when you in cognitive science, even in biology, we are getting to the point, and Aristotle would like this, and maybe even more Plotinus, where we understand possibility as a real thing. So, for example, right, and this lines up with some Eastern traditions. So I'll do this sometimes. I'll put a pencil on the table and I'll roll it. And this goes to like cutting edge work by Alicia Uraro. And I'll ask my students, why did it roll? And they give the standard sort of Newtonian answer, because you pushed it, right? And then I'll say, think. What are you not seeing? Think. And what? I said, it also rolled because there's a flat table and there's open space in front of it, and it has the shape that it has. There are, in addition to causal events, there are constraining conditions that are just as real, and they are as much explanatory of how things operate as the bottom-up causes. So think of a tree. You have all of the events causing the structure, but the structure, why does a tree have the structure it has? Because it increases the probability that a photon will hit a chlorophyll molecule. It's structuring possibility into potentiality, and that's just as much needed to explaining a tree as the chemical events causing it. We need both to explain life, to explain cognition. And more people, like Eastman's work, there's a lot of people from sort of the Whiteheadian philosophy of physics are saying we need that even for our fundamental physics, because we can't reconcile bottom-up quantum mechanics with top-down relativity. We can't do it, and we keep trying to make it's got to come from quantum up to the relative. the relativistic, which is, top down. But I would argue the fact that we've tried this strategy and we keep trying it for 40 years and it's failing is probably a reason to think that maybe we're framing the problem a fundamentally wrong way. And we have to think about, no. We have to give up a purely bottom up. We have to make the top down as real to all of our explanations. That's happening in the science right now. Now, to my mind, and I don't mean to be insulting because I don't want to be reductionistic, but that sounds a lot like a lot of the language I hear Jonathan using. And I agree, Jonathan, it's not identical, but you and I have good conversations around this. We can talk to each other. There's a chance of real communication, even communing. But that, I don't think that's specific to us. I think that's a very real possibility right here, right now. But it has to.
There's an opening up of the.
And I think what John says there is exactly right, because when now when I go back and I look at some of the videos that we made when we first just met, when we first just started, and I listened to John, and John has changed, and I have changed, and Jonathan has changed, and so that's the dialogos. Now again, I think there's a fear in some communities that, oh no, what's is John going to lead Paul out of Christianity? I don't think so. I think is Paul going to lead John into Christianity? Well, I hope so. Well, we'll see if it'll be a Neoplatonic sort of Christianity if he comes back in the fold. But I, when it comes to the question of what Jordan Peterson was asking and what he wasn't seeing in the church was a degree of movement. And again, there's going to be risk. But if there's anything I know about the Christian God, he's a risk-taking God. I say that as a Calvinist, but that's part of how the narrative plays out. You send Jesus into this world as an infant. I mean, we're just starting the Christian New Year, Advent. You send Jesus into this world as an infant, and deconstruction. Yeah, but you have to follow. You have to play through the story. You have to let the narrative unfold.
The space.
Very real possibility right here, right now. But it has to
there's an opening up of the space that's happening now. And I think people who are tuned to it can notice it. And it does have to do with what you're saying in terms of this kind of limit of science and the problem of the observer and all of these realities that everybody's trying to deal with. And it's almost like a zeitgeist. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because your experience you talked about of being traumatized and then having this separation of the two worldviews, it really is akin to the way I was trying to describe at the outset.
Yes,
the separation between, let's say, the religious in a very kind of moralistic and legalistic and materialistic way, and this kind of rise up above of these esoteric things that kind of came up in the West, whether it goes into theosophy, into all these different, very, very popular, all the occultists, all of this stuff was very, very.
Oh, no. Now, Jonathan's camera is not... Jonathan, you've got pretty good equipment. Get a camera that focuses. Get a Sony.
Very popular. We tend to ignore that, but it was extremely... had a lot of effect on culture. And so that's why it's interesting, because some people today, to me, will say things like, oh, you're saying occult things. Because I'm actually trying to reconnect these things together, right? To reconnect these things that went up too high and these things that went too low into this top-down, bottom-up reality. When you read St. Maximus the Confessor, you really do have exactly that structure that you're talking about. And I think that if you read St. Gregory of Nyssa, and especially the more mystical fathers, I think that, like you talked about pseudo-Dionysius, there are some theologians, interesting theologians right now that are positing Dionysius's theory as a solution to the problem of complexity and emergence.
Yes.
And they don't want to come on my channel yet because they're still working on their papers, but it's happening right now. Like, people are talking about it and thinking about it.
Yes.
Can I suggest something? This comes from Cardinal George of Chicago, who was kind of a mentor to me, and he was a brilliant guy. And he used to say, we start the religion science thing the wrong way because it's too much a polar opposition. That we should.
Now, I think it's helpful that, I don't know who Cardinal George is, but Cardinal George from Chicago, he's obviously a churchman. And that's where, again, I make my plea for the lament that Jordan, has left the ground, as it were, as a university professor, as a clinical psychologist, and that's been disrupted by the crazy thing that he's been on. But just wanted to make that point.
the religion science thing the wrong way because it's too much a polar opposition. That we should work on the recovery of philosophy as a rational path. And what I think he meant was a lot of people, especially young people, think the only rational path is the scientific one. That those are simply coterminous. To be rational is to be a follower of the scientific method. And so if religion isn't that, well, then it must be irrational. Well, if it introduced philosophy as indeed a rational path, that the most brilliant people in the tradition have practiced it, but it's not a scientific path. It's rational without being scientific. And that might open the door, Cardinal George used to say, to thinking about religion as also a rational path that's not scientific. I think it's hard for younger people to imagine what that is. Rational means scientific.
Well, we can help them out to some degree. I mean, I titled my first book "Maps of Meaning" for a very specific reason, is that this narrative structure is a map.
Yeah.
What that means, if that's true, and I do believe it's true, and I studied a lot of the early work on hippocampal function from animal researchers, and they made some real fundamental discoveries in the field of cognition. It's like we need a map to traverse the world. It's not optional. Without a map, you're lost, and to be lost is a terrible thing. And so, and there's rationality in the development of a map. There better be, because otherwise it doesn't get you to where you want to go. And you certainly want to get away from being lost, let's say. And science is not a map. It's a description of the terrain without direction.
Yeah.
There's direction there, I suppose, but it's implicit. The scientists impose that direction by following the dictates of their intuition of meaning. But science...
And I also think there need to be guides. There are maps, but there needs to be guides. And those guides are going to need to be agents.
And to be lost is a terrible thing. And so, and there's rationality in the development of a map. There better be, because otherwise it doesn't get you to where you want to go. And you certainly want to get away from being lost, let's say. And science is not a map. It's a description of the terrain without direction.
Yeah.
There's direction there, I suppose, but it's implicit. The scientists impose that direction by following the dictates of their intuition of meaning. But science itself doesn't offer a map.
Yeah. Right.
Well, there's no rationality outside of science. Okay, well, they let the irrational people design the map. Well, that's what's happening with the politicization of our culture.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And so the religion, and then the rationalists, they say, well, if we...
There's a hole in the culture where the church used to be. And I think that's exactly what Jordan is talking about right there.
We weren't religious and we weren't superstitious, well, everyone would be rational and wouldn't the world be a better place? And I think, no, the religious would drop into the political. And then you watch what happens. And we are...
And that's what's the caving into the hole.
Watching what
and
happens.
That has happened.
Because there's no domain for the religious now, no specified domain. So tiny things become imbued with religious significance because there's no proper place, right? And that's not good. And so it's not that, it's not impossible. I mean, I don't see a flaw in this claim. I can't see a flaw in it. It's like, don't we need a map? Well, can science provide that map? I've never heard a thoroughly critical, scientifically trained, deep philosopher make the case that science can provide the direction for ethical behavior. And that's the map. What's good? Where should we head? So well, then what do we do with that? There's nothing? There's nothing? There's no map?
No, and that's why I objected so much to that claim that science belongs in the highest place, that physical sciences are the queen of the sciences. That can't be right. Because that's saying the one that can't provide the map is governing all the other ways of knowing, and that can't be right. But I think we have lost a sense of that. And again, I think as a religious person, I'll take some responsibility. I think we have not been great at providing the map, and we have to recover that for sure.
Well, Bishop, I think this follows from what you and Jordan were talking about. One of the problems about invoking philosophy is which one do you mean? Do you mean academic philosophy, or do you mean the philosophy that Pierre Hadot has brought back? Where
that one I think is better. Yeah, it's a way of life.
Well, yes.
Now, Vervaeke has said it many times. Usually, if I'm in the middle of a conversation, It's there was this really nice article in First Things on What is Ancient Philosophy by Benjamin Ballant, and I hadn't had hardly any introduction to Hadot, and I thought it was a very very interesting read, and so lovely to have John Vervaeke prompt me to learn more things.
And what I would point to is that points us to a kind of what's the difference between the academic philosophy, and I have training in that, and philosophy as a way of life, and it goes to points that Jonathan was making about the how much the transformation. Look, the Cartesian claim is that all truths are available to a method. If you go to earlier, the Neoplatonic tradition, right? It's like no. There are some truths that will only be disclosed if you go through fundamental transformation, and so we have to talk about the rationality of transformation, which is about the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory transformation.
And what he said there was so helpful in that. I'll just play it again because it's worth listening. I have to listen to things multiple times to get it through my thick skull.
And the Neoplatonic tradition about the how much the transformation. Look, the Cartesian claim is that all truths are available to a method.
Right there, all truths are available to a method. Now think about the implications of that assertion. And just think about it in normal terms. Can you know what it's like to grow up in Audrey Assad's Plymouth Brethren Church? How about the little community where John Vervaeke grew up? There's a degree to which standpoint epistemology, which gets a lot of press because of some of the culture war stuff, you have to acknowledge its point. You also have to see its limitations. They're both there, but that's wisdom to get down to that level.
Go to earlier, the Neoplatonic tradition, right? It's like no. There are some truths that will only be disclosed if you go through fundamental transformation, and so we have to talk about the rationality of transformation, which is about the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory transformation. And the thing about this, and this is what's really exciting, is a lot of the work is showing that, I got a series that right now doing with Greg Enriquez and Zach Stein, that you can't infer your way through transformation. This goes to, the person who wrote the book on this is L.A. Paul. I know Laurie, she's a great philosopher. Tight analytic argument to make the point, you can't infer your way through a transformative process. And so you have to ask the question, okay, is it just willy-nilly? No, what do human beings actually do? What kind of rationality? Agnes Callard did this in her book on aspiration. She calls it proleptic rationality. What is the rationality? What does it look like when people are going through fundamental transformations in order to conform to reality? That's their way of getting at the truth rather than marshaling a method. And so I go back to my point again, we need to expand the notion of rationality and the way it was exemplified in Philia Sophia rather than the way it is exemplified, I would say, in still to a large degree, academic philosophy. I went into...
Yeah, I agree. Can I invoke your...
The academic philosophers have the same problem that Bishop Barron described about the priesthood.
Yeah. But
that's how it looks.
Could I invoke your countryman again, Lonergan? We had those 4 imperatives. If you want to know the world, you've got to be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, and be responsible. And he describes all 4 of those. But his point was, we tend not to be those 4 things. The mind is fallen. It falls away from attention. It doesn't see what's there. Or even like, John, to use your stuff, it doesn't maybe make the right siphoning moves to say, let me be attentive to the right things. Mm-hmm. It's not intelligent, which for him meant it doesn't have insights. So it doesn't discern intelligible form. It's not reasonable, meaning it doesn't make judgments. So I'm looking at a phenomenon. I say it could be this, could be this, could be that. but I never make the judgment to say, no, that's truly what this thing is. And then finally, it's not responsible, meaning it doesn't follow up the implications of its judgments. But what he was getting from his own Christian tradition, I think, was the deep sense of the fallenness of the mind. The mind is, it's not a wreck, but it's compromised, and it needs to go through a disciplinary process. It has to go, and that's, I think, what Pierre Hadot and those people are recovering from the ancient world, is you had to go through. Plato's Academy was not a classroom where you sit and take in Plato's theory of the forms. It was a way of life, and you learned a manner of being and knowing and so on. So
that First Things article on Pierre Hadot. It should come as no surprise, then, that the philosophers of antiquity, from pre-Socratics to the late Neoplatonists, flourished in tight communities of shared dialogue and practice. The Stoic age, Seneca counsels that the living word and the life in common will benefit you more than the written discourse. And I think this is true of the YouTube. You can watch YouTube channels all you want, but you have to somehow be in dialogos, in dialogue, in conversation. It's in this meeting each other and finding each other where things begin to change inside of us, when transformations occur. The Stoic sage Seneca counseled that the living word and the life in common will benefit you more than the written discourse, and his contemporaries indeed tended to think together and to think out loud. For Aristotle, as for others, Hadot said, the discussion of problems was ultimately more formative than their solution. Membership in a philosophical school entailed not doctrinal allegiance, but, as Hadot put it, the choice of, when we set that up as such, I don't think that helps us, because in some ways, if you take this idea, it becomes a doctrine itself. And this, on one hand, modernity is an overreaching of the propositional, and it hence in our reaction to it, we get allergic to the propositional. Whereas what we want is the proper calibration of the propositional within the rest of the knowing ways. Membership in a philosophical school entailed not the doctrinal allegiance, but, as Hadot puts it, the choice of a certain way of life, an existential option which demands from the individual a total change of lifestyle, a conversion of one's entire being, and ultimately a certain desire to be and to live in a certain way. And so when you look at how do you keep the politician from corruption? Being present in the philosophical realm or in the political realm will tend to lead to corruption. There needs to be another factor and force in that individual's life where it's just politics. Just, screw it, I'll take the money. No, bigger things are at stake. That formation needs to come from someplace else. And right now there's a hole in the culture, and Peterson's way has a degree of, you need that formation in people, but that formation probably isn't just going to happen willy-nilly out there in the culture. If this strikes you as closer to religion than philosophy, you're then thinking like an early Christian. For far from rejecting pagan philosophy, Hadot notes, Christianity borrowed from it extensively, ultimately deriving its very conception of itself from Greek thought. The fledgling religion presented itself not only as a philosophy in the ancient sense of the term, but as the philosophy. If doing philosophy meant living in conformity with reason, the thinking went. If it really presents a conversation of one's entire being, then Christians were philosophers, and at least some philosophers Christians. Hence, we find the apologist Justin, for example, declaring scarcely a century after Jesus that those who, before Christ, led a life accompanied by reason are Christians, even if they are known as atheists, such as Socrates, Heraclitus, and those like them. Hadot further argues that the first Christians annexed from philosophy not only large swaths of ancient ideological landscape, but also many of its spiritual practices. In early Christian exercises aiming to instill virtues such as peace of mind and absence of the passions, in tradition of contemplative monasticism as developed by such 4th century church fathers as Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory Nestori Nazianzen, Hadot detects a strong whiff of Greek philosophical practice. Hadot admits that these exercises formed part of the broader ensemble of practices which were specifically Christian. Still, though, the Christian philosophers tried to Christianize their use of secular philosophical themes. They could not help describing their spiritual exercises by means of vocabulary and concepts of secular philosophy. The heart of Hadot's argument lies in his contention that in the process of digesting it, Christianity slowly but inexorably broke philosophy apart. The ancient schools, and for this reason, there's sort of a sense in which philosophy ends in the classical period and reemerges in the modern period, because you have the sense that there's, especially the modern sense, that the church inside the whole is collapsing. The ancient schools that had not disappeared, Platonism and Aristotelianism in particular, removed from the ways of life that inspired them, were reduced to the status of mere conceptual material which could be used in theological controversies. Philosophy made to serve theology became merely theoretical. Aristotelian logic and ontology, for example, furnished concepts that were indispensable for the formation of the dogmas of the Trinity and Incarnation. But Christianity itself, a pervasive way of life, had little use for the practical elements of ancient philosophy other than those it chose to appropriate. So when philosophy emerged many centuries later in its own again to breathe the air of the Enlightenment, it considered itself a theoretical science because the existential dimension of philosophy no longer had any meaning from the perspective of Christianity. And so it was, Hadot concludes, that philosophy, stripped of its conceptual content, became the impoverished thing it is today. And I think that then goes right into, you can read the whole article. I'll have to remember to put the link in the video. You can see both Christianity sort of absorbing philosophy, and then in the Enlightenment, when you want to have something that reemerges, it's this desiccated theoretical thing that we sort of have left with in modernity. Now, a terrific video that most of you haven't watched, a good many of you have, Nate's channel only has 163 subs, so you can get in below the 200 mark. There you go. This terrific conversation on Goethe, science, and sophiology with John Vervaeke and Michael Martin. And this whole video was just a wonderful video. I want to play part of it. Where can I get in? Where's a good place to jump in here?
Socially damaging.
So Martin is an interesting guy. I don't know a lot about him. Nate's been really pushing him on me a lot. And so hopefully we'll have a conversation. He's got both a foot in academia, but also in sort of the Waldorf community, which, as those of you know, my wife teaches in a Waldorf school. So I've got some familiarity with that. But so then he's into the bioorganic farming, and he's got a lot of children. And there's a bunch of reasons why Nate Heil, wants to sort of ship the two of us. But I thought I haven't read Michael Martin's book. I was not terribly familiar with it, and there's just so many conversations to follow. But this one really caught my eye and really grabbed my imagination, partly because of Goethe, who's a very interesting figure. Rudolf Steiner, another very interesting figure. And of course, Barfield really went down the Rudolf Steiner route. I mean, there's some issues with Steiner. Part of what Pageau was talking about in terms of there was this impoverishment in the 19th century at the height of modernity, that things broke out in, the Rosicrucian. There's this amazing Rosicrucian museum in San Jose, which I visited a number of times when we were homeschooling our children, just because you can see all the Egyptian artifacts. But, a bunch of stuff just broke out in the 19th century in these areas. It was just way too much pent up stuff that was way too suppressed. And then it just breaks out in sort of all kinds of crazy forms. But the attempt to now, reintegrate wisdom into the world
down the line, you have to assume,
is coming. It is. The mental health tsunami is coming. It's already starting, and it's coming, and it's going to get worse. Very much. The Great Resignation is in part a massive response to the way COVID sort of made stark the meaning crisis for a lot of people in very powerful ways.
Right. And I think that for me, I mean, there was a crisis for meaning for us, and that was a way to address it.
Right.
Is it the way to address it? I don't know, but it was a way to address it.
Right. I think Paul Vanderklay's Estuary project is also like pretty good, which I've been in person.
Fun to get Estuary into it. And if you get into the Estuary Host Support Network, if I have that right, John Van Donk, and Nate's been big into that.
Involved in. I'm gonna be hosting an Estuary group at my church starting in December.
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough to be part of a very small Anglican church that like tolerates.
Here for small churches. Again, I want to give mega churches their due and their place, but there's experiments that you can do in a small church that you'll never be able to do in a mega church.
It's my very open heterodox kind of meanness. So it's not really a problem for me. It's a very small, close community, so I'm lucky in that way. But I'm also very hyper aware of like how other people have this need to be connected to this. And I think what Paul is doing with Estuary is actually a really good move in that direction.
That's a good point.
Because it like in practice, since I've been participating in it through the Estuary host conversations, like it has a lot of resemblances to kind of like what goes on in AA to a certain degree, right? Which is actually like, I think there's a lot for the church to learn from that. And you don't have to be someone who suffers from drug addiction.
And in many ways, AA is exactly what Peterson was talking about at the Cambridge Union when it's listening to each other. It's small. It scales through multiplication of small things. It's attention. It's discipline. Now, it's, AA is supposed to be anonymous to a degree, so you're supposed to be able to go in there if you have an alcohol problem and not lose your job. But yet there is discipline and there is accountability, and it's of a different kind where, if you fall off the wagon, yeah. I mean, again, look at Chad the Alcoholics. My conversation with Chad the Alcoholic,
or alcoholism to benefit from what AA is doing, or to have something that functions in that model that is open to anyone who wants to come, is a good thing. So.
Or perhaps the Eightfold Path as an ecology of practices.
Sure.
There's some preliminary evidence, and so that's all it is, but it is evidence nevertheless, that rehabilitation programs based on the Eightfold Path model do better than the 12-step model, just generally. And so, I think we should be really empirical, and in that sense, scientific about the proposal of these.
Well, what causes the results is spiritual transformation. So maybe more people are able, for whatever, in my opinion, I think it's spiritual transformation that is actually, whatever it is that people, they're coming into contact with spiritual transformation through AA or the Eightfold Path or whatever it is. And the truth of the matter is we might need different models for different people.
I think is highly plausible. I think demographic pluralism is a reality. And certainly if we're dealing with trauma, we should have, we should have a rich repertoire of programs available for people. I totally agree with that. But that again, that's a different, we're now proposing a different kind of institutional structure than we have done typically in the past.
Yeah.
Typically we have, here's our program, sign on or get lost, right? And that, I think I think there needs to be a lot more flexibility given the fact that we are now, I think, coming to accept the significant differentiation between people. How they come to the real possibility of transformation. There's a lot of variation in how that happens, and I think the time for denying that has passed. And So that's interesting. I should talk to Paul more about that. I like the fact that there were people from there's a Discord community that is set up around my work and my project, and then Paul's community, and they have entered into. I just did. Paul and I did a thing together with bridging between them, and they have entered into what I think could properly be called fellowship. They reinforce each other, they support each other, they explore each other, they challenge each other, they self-correct, or they correct each other and drive each other to self-correct. I'm really, really pleased with that. I had nothing to do with that, and that again speaks to me that there's a lot of people are. I like this Latin word inventio, which means about to discover and make. There's the inventio of these new ways, and it's just popping up all over the place. And again, the fact that the mainstream media and our political machinery is completely indifferent and blind to this. The fact that they can't even, like, they won't even describe the Great Resignation as the Great Resignation. They're starting to now, but for a long, it was a labor shortage. No. People are doing, there's not some abstract lack of a resource. There's millions of people basically saying we want more meaning, and more importantly, we're willing to take a hit in our standard of living if it gives us the promise of more meaning.
Yeah.
And they're not paying attention to that. They're not paying attention to that at all.
Well, I don't think they can. I just don't think the structures allow for it. It's just.
You could be right.
Well, and I think it's an impoverishment of education too. I mean.
Yes,
I think, they haven't, like you were talking about, in fact, when I taught philosophy at a Catholic college, the book I started in my intro to philosophy course was Pageau.
Right.
Philosophy is a way of life.
Oh, great book.
And because, I noticed, and I was teaching in a inner city Catholic college with mostly Black students, and they were totally into those questions.
Yes. Yes.
They would just, wow, I'm waiting for somebody to ask me these things,
Yes.
And so it was really, and people are starving for it. But I think, so many of the people in, they're probably in their 30s and 40s in education or in journalism now, they haven't had those questions. They haven't had that grounding generally.
Well, because we haven't seen questions about personal transformation and meaning as practical questions when they're the most practical questions that there really are.
Yeah, it's been replaced by GDP, right? But I have a question. This is like a little off topic, but I was, I know, John, your interest in Neoplatonism. Would you describe yourself as a Neoplatonist?
I describe myself as a post-nominalist Neoplatonist.
Okay.
I think I don't think we can just go back to the Neoplatonism before nominalism.
I have a question then, and because this touches on sophiology. What is your take on the world soul, the idea of the world soul?
So I think it's, for me, I take it that the universe is recursively self-organizing in a tremendously fractal and almost incomprehensible way. And that is very much, I think, at least the scientific analog of what the world soul was. Let me try and do it a little bit more, right? I think I'm a little bit, not peeved. Materialism is, first of all, they often confuse corporeality with materialism, right? Which is a mistake. And then they confuse materialism with, there's patterns, right? Scientists believe in patterns, E equals MC squared, right? And the thing about that is that's not an event, that's not an object, it's not located right here or there. It's a real structuring of possibility that constrains how things emerge. So this is my Neoplatonism is in this sense very much like Erigena. I think of a complete interpenetration of emergence and emanation, and at all levels. And this is a terrifically this expresses itself in a terrific, a terrifically
And I, every time he says self-organizing, I think, what does that mean? I don't know. It always strikes me as sort of fudgy, because it's self-organized. It basically means it organizes with a power that we can't account for. That this is built into the system. And then we're sort of back to his conversations with Sam on Transformed, that the universe seems designed to do this.
Complex and I think ultimately beautiful form of self-organization. For me, that's what's meant by the world soul. The universe, in a sense, is as much responsible for its existence as anything else is, if I can put it that way. I'm not arguing for pantheism. What I mean is, let me give you an analogy. One of the things we're discovering, and it's odd that it's becoming discovery, right? As we adopt the idea of cognition as inherently dynamical and developmental, is that you as a self-organizing thing play a big role in your development. Now, I know that sounds like, of course, but it took a while to get there where we now, and that's what I'm trying to say. The universe plays a big role in its development.
Which seems to be nearly the definition of agency.
At multiscalar levels. And so for me, that whole vertical of emanation and emergence and the horizontal, directing itself.
Well, so John, I can't hate when you say that. I can't help but think of Emil Book, the Anthroposophist, whose text we've been analyzing on my channel. In one of his discussions of Revelation, he sees the 144,000 singing the new song in Revelation as a participation in that co-creation of the new heaven and the new earth.
Yeah,
there's a role to be played by human consciousness in that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways, I think so. I mean, one of the ways of responding to, sort of a general statement, said in general about our sort of cosmological insignificance is to move from a quantitative analysis to a qualitative one, right? Where we may be small causally, but in terms of disclosing the possibilities of being, we are really, really important. We are really, really important, such that I can say this without even a hesitation of thought. Do I want a universe with or without life? With life. There you go. Because that was easy. And do I want right? And do I want a universe with or without intelligent life? Again, intelligent life. Why? Because right, there's the capacity. I'm not trying to make even a weak anthropomorphic argument here, but there is the disclosure in us of being. And in that sense, I think we can participate in the sacred in a way that other beings can't, and therefore we have a special responsibility. Right. I think that's part of what reverence is. Reverence is that, first of all, not how things are relevant to me, how am I relevant to them, and does that relevance carry with it a sense of responsibility? I think that's what reverence properly is. And so I think our capacity for genuine reverence makes us qualitatively important to disclosing the possibilities of something like the world soul. I don't typically use that word, but I'm using it because you introduced it, Michael. Sometimes this actually happens to me. And it's an aesthetic experience, but it's more than an aesthetic experience. I'll see a cat go by. My partner has cats, and she's really converted me. I really love cats now. I used to think of them as land sharks with brains, but now, right. There's this one cat, and he's an amazing. But the cat goes by, and I think, what? And see how this is like the Greek question about being. But I ask, what must the universe be like such that it can produce a cat? Like what? That reveals something about it that isn't revealed in sort of the nuts and bolts of chemistry, or even the nuts and bolts of certain parts of biology.
See, and I would say he's seeing the glory of the cat. What is that glory? It's akin to the sacred, but it's the sacred is sort of a hushed withdrawal, and the glory is just the bright shining,
etc. There's something more that's being disclosed there. And so that's my answer to you, Nate. I hope that made some sense. Yeah. So did Michael, did this address your question?
Disclosure. Pardon me?
Did my answer address your question?
No, I was investigating your work. I thought, what do you think about this? Because a lot of people do compare the idea of Sophia to the world soul, and I thought it'd be a good point of intersection. And but I think what you're talking about, this idea of disclosure that Heidegger really talks about quite a bit, right? Yeah. But he also, I think Heidegger in Being and Time offers a great model for this with this, if you think in stages as first the being hurled towards death.
Yes.
Then the disclosure, right? When you finally drop all the persona, and what arises from that, for Heidegger, he calls it care, right?
Yes.
And but reverence, I think, is also an adequate term for that. It's analogous to his idea of care, because when you get to that place as a human being, your disposition towards the world has changed.
And that's it. Like like when Socrates is asking the what is question, he's not asking a question of curiosity. He's not seeing, like, in curiosity, your cup is half filled and you want to fill it up so that you can repair your knowledge. But wonder is you empty your cup more, right? You empty your cup more. What is it? What is it? Because he's trying. There's often in the dialogues, there's no answer, precisely because there is no answer to be given. What you see, you can see some of his interlocutors realizing, is that what's being cultivated is right relationship, right? The right relationship to other people and the right relationship to being itself.
Yes.
And I think, again, but here's my...
And that's not too far from loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. It's
criticism of Heidegger. Heidegger does this, he talks it, but there's nothing in Heidegger about, and this, this is a Hadot critique, there's nothing in there about the practices.
Right.
Like what do you do? My friend, Guy Senstock, created circling. He created the whole, and this has become a movement, because he was trying to figure out how to put Heidegger into practice, right? And so there was that's a real problem that, and I also don't like Heidegger's Heidegger builds a mystique around himself that I find very, very off-putting. I'm the great thinker, and I can never completely disclose my thoughts to you. Okay.
But I think he does offer a kind of practice in his writings on poetry, which is where I first caught it, right? Mm-hmm. I saw where he was going.
Oh,
in his writings and poetry.
No, that's a very good point, Michael. Yeah. I suppose then.
And to me, that's not trivial, because poetry really is prayer. Like, it just is. Like that is exactly.
Nate throws down is categorical.
Exactly what poetry is, and it doesn't matter no matter what. And what's interesting is that different kinds of poems can be different kinds of prayers.
Anne Lamott, thank you. Help me. I don't think it's great poetry, Nate.
Too.
Yes.
So it's like a Bukowski poem is no less a prayer than a George Herbert poem. They're all an attempt to communicate with being,
and Heidegger
understand how, and to understand how you relate to it.
And Heidegger is he's preoccupied with Holderlin, right? Which is, I think, an important location, because
okay, there's a taste of that video. It was an excellent video. I don't know if I'll treat it more. I got to finish this video up because I'm not doing another episode on it.
I think that's true in any intellectual discipline. You've got to be knowing, and you learned a manner of being and knowing and so on. So I think that's true in any intellectual discipline. You've got to be converted. And you have to acknowledge, and we have to acknowledge your sin in a way, that your mind is not what it should be, and you got to go through a discipline.
Well, gentlemen, we've passed our 2-hour mark, and so I think, and I'm starting to drift.
And I've way past 2 hours.
Somewhat. So I'm going to call this to a halt, I think, somewhat arbitrarily, unless there are pressing issues that any of you would like to conclude with. Maybe a concluding statement from each of you might be a nice thing. Jonathan, I put you on the spot. Do you want to say something to close up?
Sure. I mean, I think that, first of all, Jordan, thank you for the opportunity for us to talk, to speak to each other. I never met Bishop Barron. I had some admiration for him, and obviously for you and for John. And I think that these discussions are very fruitful. And I think that these, especially as people watch them, it's because it's obviously not just happening here. It's people watch them, get engaged, and kind of people who haven't listened to John's things or haven't listened to Bishop Barron's things or mine, you know, to kind of see what is the discussion happening now, because a lot of the things we brought up are really on fire in terms of subjects in the world, and so need to be continuously explored, and we need more people to dive in. And so thanks for the opportunity.
John?
I want to reinforce what Jonathan just said. It's been wonderful. The 2 hours flew by for me. It was wonderful to meet you, Bishop. And I think we could have some wonderful conversations in depth about, the project of perhaps.
Now, part of, you'll catch John often say that part of, he keeps, I do these monologues and these commentaries, but John keeps mostly he has to dialogos, for some reasons. And so it'd be fun to listen to John and Bishop Barron have a convo.
Perhaps integrating Neoplatonism and science. I think Lonergan would be help, and insight, of course, was crucial to that. So I really appreciate all of that. I just wanted to say that I take the meaning crisis very seriously, and I think COVID has made it worse. I've got a lot of evidence for that, and I think it's a vain hope that everything's just going to go back to the way it was. I think that is not where we should place our existential or epistemic bets. And I think we need to ramp up the project of getting the call to a sapiential framework and a way of life to people out there. So that's what would be my final word.
Bishop.
Yeah, mine again is just to thank everybody. I enjoyed it immensely, and I agree with John. The time flew by, and I found it fascinating. The recovery of the wisdom tradition over and against this deadening scientism, the recovery of value over and against this equally deadening culture of self-invention, that I just generate my own values. I think that, bores me to death.
Good luck trying that.
No, it bores me to death, and I think it's killing people spiritually. So the recovery of the wisdom tradition, the recovery of objective value, culminating, speaking as a Catholic bishop, in God, the supreme value. That's the key to meaning.
Well, the dude could be succinct, unlike some of the rest of us.
Thanks very much, guys, for participating in this. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure I pray all of that we'll have a chance to converse again, and that people who are listening are benefited by this, and that we do this immense technology that we have at our fingertips, so surprisingly ethical justice, and help dispense whatever wisdom we've managed to cobble together to as many people as we possibly can, and invite them along.
Thanks. God bless you all.
Oops, just missed it. Nope.
Them along.
Thanks.
Someone caught that on Twitter. It's interesting, the two that did it and the two that didn't. Very, very interesting. Anyway, okay, I've done it. I've treated it. I've pulled some other stuff in. I hope it was helpful. Hopefully I'll get all the links below. If I miss a link, ask me in the comment section and I'll put it in. And yeah, this is part of the ongoing. And again, it can't just be thinky talky. You've got to do something. You've got to be in relationship. There must be transformation. And again, to go back to Peterson, Peterson at the Cambridge Union, the transformation should not just be, why can't I find it? The transformation proximal betterment is good, but the proximal betterment has to scale all the way up. And Peterson is sort of pointing at that with the theoretical witness to the better, the ultimate better. But I think, again, the hole in the middle of the culture left by the church has to address that. So thus ends the commentary on this. Will I do another one? Who knows? Will they do another one? Better question. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment.